She was the most powerful woman in the room, and the most alone. Celine Ashcroft had survived a helicopter crash that shattered her spine, rebuilt a billion-dollar company from a wheelchair, and never once let anyone see her cry. Until the night a stranger knelt beside her broken machinery in the dark, a man who smelled like motor oil in cold winter air, and she forgot, just for one unguarded moment, that she wasn't supposed to need anyone. She whispered 3 words she thought disappeared into the silence. They didn't. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Like and follow so you never miss what happens next. The storm hit Chicago like something personal. It didn't build gradually the way winter storms usually did. The slow gray gathering of clouds, the first tentative flakes that gave people time to cancel plans and pull their kids inside. This one arrived in the span of 40 minutes like a door being slammed shut on the entire city. One moment, the streets outside the Ashcroft Industries Tower were slick but passable. The next, the wind was screaming between skyscrapers hard enough to rattle the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 32nd floor. And the snow was coming down sideways, dense and merciless, swallowing streetlights whole. Marcus Webb, the building's overnight facilities manager, stood at the lobby windows with his phone pressed to his ear and a look on his face like a man receiving very bad news from a doctor. He was. They're saying 30 inches by morning, he said to no one in particular, because the lobby was nearly empty. The last of the administrative staff had rushed out 2 hours ago when the weather alerts started stacking up. Interstate's already closed. Expressways are parking lots. He hung up the phone and stared at the elevator panel on the wall, specifically at the amber warning light that had started blinking 17 minutes ago on the B-level indicator. That little light meant the building's primary hydraulic lift system, the one that controlled 3 of the 4 elevators in the tower, and, more critically, the specialized accessibility lift in the executive wing, had developed a pressure fault. In 40 years of facilities work, Marcus had learned that amber lights had a way of becoming red lights if you left them alone long enough. He pulled out his phone again and scrolled through his emergency contacts until he found the number for Holloway Mechanical. Jace Holloway was in the middle of reading Charlotte's Web to his youngest, Lily, who was 5 and had recently decided that she would only go to sleep if the story was read in what she called the sad voice, when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He held up one finger to Lily without looking away from the page. 1 second, Bug. She grabbed his arm with both hands. Wilbur hasn't found out yet. I know. He's going to be really sad. I know, baby. He picked up the phone and checked the screen. Unfamiliar number, Chicago area code. Normally he'd let it go to voicemail. He had a rule about work calls after 8, but the storm was already bad enough that he'd been checking the emergency weather line every half hour, and something about the timing made him answer. Holloway? Mr. Holloway, this is Marcus Webb at Ashcroft Industries downtown. We have a hydraulic systems failure in our elevator bank, specifically the executive lift system. The building's emergency contact list says you're certified for Otis and ThyssenKrupp commercial systems. Jace looked at the window. Snow was hitting the glass in sheets. You're aware there's a blizzard, he said. I'm aware. A pause. Mr. Holloway, we have a situation beyond the elevator. Our CEO is in the building. She was working late when the weather closed in. She uses a wheelchair, and the freight elevator that still works doesn't have the right specifications for her chair. It's too narrow. If we can't get the executive lift running, she's on the 32nd floor until the storm breaks. That could be 18 hours. Jace looked at Lily. She had fallen sideways onto her pillow and was watching him with large, solemn eyes, still clutching the edge of the book. Daddy has to go to work, he said quietly, not into the phone. She didn't argue. She was 5, but she'd grown up fast, the way kids who lose parents early sometimes do. She just reached up and patted his hand twice, like a small adult. Tell Wilbur it's okay, she said. It took him 40 minutes to drive 12 miles, which was actually better than he'd expected. The truck was old, a 2008 F250 with 160,000 miles, and a replaced transmission. But it was heavy, and he knew how to drive in snow. He'd grown up in Minnesota. Snow was not a mystery to him. The mystery was why he was doing this at all. He didn't need the money. Not desperately, not the way he had in the years right after Dana died, when 3 kids under 6 and a mortgage and a shop lease had all been sitting on his chest simultaneously. The business had stabilized. He had a crew now, 2 full-time guys and a part-timer who came in on weekends. He could have told Marcus Webb to call someone else, put the phone down, and gone back to Charlotte's Web. Instead, he was white-knuckling it down Michigan Avenue in a blizzard at 9:30 at night, which probably said something about him that a therapist would find interesting. He parked in the loading bay because everything else was either blocked or buried, unloaded his main kit, and buzzed the service entrance. Marcus met him at the door, a heavy-set black man in his 60s with a gray beard and the careful eyes of someone who had been managing buildings long enough to have seen everything go wrong at least once. He looked at Jace's kit bag, then at Jace, with an expression of undisguised relief. "You made it." "Barely." Jace stomped snow off his boots. "Show me the mechanical room first, then the lift itself." The problem was worse than the phone call had suggested, which was almost always how it went. The hydraulic system for the executive elevator had developed not one fault, but 2. A slow pressure leak in the main pump line that had been quietly bleeding for probably 3 weeks, and a failed solenoid valve in the safety bypass circuit that had finally given up entirely sometime that evening. Together, they'd taken the elevator offline completely and triggered the building's safety lockout. The good news was that neither issue required parts he didn't have in his truck. The bad news was that the combined repair in a cramped, poorly lit mechanical room on a night when his hands were still cold from the drive was going to take time. "Best estimate?" Marcus asked, standing in the doorway. 3 hours. Maybe 3.5. Jace was already on his knees, pulling the access panel off the pump housing. "Could be less if the bypass solenoid isn't corroded." "Is it corroded?" Jace shone his flashlight into the housing. The solenoid was the color of old pennies. "It's corroded," he said. Marcus blew out a breath. "I'll let Miss Ashcroft know." Celine Ashcroft knew before Marcus called her office. She knew because she'd been watching the building's diagnostic screen on her laptop. She had the building's entire systems interface accessible from her workstation, which was one of the small, practical adaptations she'd made without ever calling attention to it. And she'd watched the elevator status go from amber to red to fully offline over the course of a little over an hour. She'd also done the math herself. The freight elevator's interior was 61 centimeters wide. Her power chair required 73. She'd measured it the day she moved into this office, quietly, without telling anyone, because knowing the dimensions of every space she occupied had become a habit that started the day she woke up in a hospital bed and was told she would never use her legs again. When Marcus called to tell her that a repair technician was on site and estimated 3 to 4 hours, she thanked him and told him to let her know when the work was complete. She did not tell him that she had been working for 11 hours straight, that her back hurt in the dull, insistent way it did when she'd been in the chair too long, or that she had spent the last 20 minutes staring at the window watching snow obliterate Chicago and feeling something she refused to name. She turned back to her screens. There were 3 financial reports open, a legal brief from her outside counsel regarding the upcoming board review, and a draft letter she'd been revising for 2 days and still hadn't sent. She had work. She always had work. Work was the thing that had kept her sane in the 6 months of recovery after the crash. The thing that had given her a reason to be in the chair at 7 in the morning instead of still in bed. The thing that made her feel like herself when almost everything else about her life had become unrecognizable. She stared at the financial report. She read the same paragraph 4 times. She closed the laptop. At 11:15, Marcus tapped on the doorframe of her office. "Ms. Ashcroft, the technician is going to need to run a test cycle on the system. It's going to require power from the main office circuit on this floor briefly. Lights might flicker. I just wanted to let you know." "Of course," she looked up. "Where is he working?" "He's in the auxiliary mechanical room, end of the hall, past the conference wing." She nodded. "I'd like to speak with him." Marcus hesitated, just briefly, the way people sometimes did when she asked to do things they hadn't anticipated. "I can send him in when he has a moment. I'll go to him." She said it quietly, but without any particular invitation for discussion, and Marcus, who had worked for her for 4 years and understood the architecture of her authority, simply nodded. The hallway between her office and the conference wing was long and carpeted, and the building had gone quiet the way only large buildings go quiet late at night. That specific hush of HVAC systems and distant city noise and the particular kind of emptiness that only exists when a space built for hundreds of people contains almost none of them. Celine moved through it without hurry. She had learned to stop hurrying in the chair, not because she couldn't move quickly when she needed to, but because hurrying in a wheelchair in environments that weren't designed for her looked different than hurrying on foot, and she had made a deliberate choice 2 years ago to stop performing urgency for other people's comfort. The door to the auxiliary mechanical room was propped open with a rubber wedge. The lights inside were on, work lights, harsh and white, and she could hear someone moving, the metallic sound of tools, and what she thought was, very quietly, someone humming. She stopped in the doorway. The man on the floor had his back to her, upper body half inside an open access panel, one arm extended out of sight into the machinery. He was big, wide through the shoulders, built like someone who used his body for work rather than for show. His hair was dark and a little too long, like a haircut that was 3 weeks overdue, and there was grease on the back of his left hand and on the knee of his jeans. He was humming something she didn't recognize. She watched him for a moment without speaking, which was unusual for her. She was not normally a person who watched and waited. She spoke in meetings before half the room had finished opening their laptops. She finished other people's sentences when they were taking too long, and she could see where they were going. Her executives had learned to keep their presentations tight, because Celine Ashcroft would cut you off the moment she understood your point, which was usually before you'd finished making it. But she stood in the doorway and said nothing. He pulled his arm back, sat up slightly, and reached to his right for a socket wrench. And that was when he noticed her, because he went still in the way people do when they suddenly register a presence they weren't expecting. He turned around. He had a good face. That was her first thought, which surprised her because she wasn't generally in the habit of characterizing people's faces as good or otherwise on first impression. But it was the right word. He had a face that looked like it had been through things. There were lines around his eyes that weren't from squinting at blueprints, and something in his expression had the settled quality of a person who had learned to take difficulty without flinching. Not hard, just settled. Ms. Ashcroft. He said it without scrambling to his feet, without any of the performative deference she was used to. He simply registered who she was and acknowledged it calmly. Marcus said you might stop by. He's optimistic about things like that. She moved into the room a little further. How's the work going? Slower than I wanted. He held up the solenoid valve, a small, greasy cylinder the approximate size of a toilet paper roll. This is the culprit. It should have been replaced about 18 months ago based on the corrosion. Whoever does your maintenance contracts was cutting corners. She looked at the part. I'll look into that. The pump line sealed and holding pressure. Once I get the replacement solenoid fitted and run the test cycle, you should have the lift back. He set the old part down. Probably another hour and a half. Good. She paused. What's your name? Jace Holloway. How far did you drive in this, Mr. Holloway? He glanced toward the window. There was one small, high-set window in the mechanical room, and it showed nothing but white. About 12 miles. Took 40 minutes. Why did you come? He looked at her for a moment like the question was slightly more interesting than he'd expected. Marcus said you were stuck up here. Marcus could have found someone else. Probably. He picked up the socket wrench again. But he called me. She watched him turn back to the access panel. Carry on, she said, and reversed back into the hallway. She went back to her office and sat in the dark for a while. Not completely dark. The city below was reflecting off the snow, giving everything a gray-white ambient glow that came through the floor-to-ceiling windows. In weather like this, with the storm absorbing all the sound of the city, the 32nd floor felt like being on a ship in the middle of a very bright, very white ocean. She turned her chair to face the window and just looked at it for a while. She didn't often let herself do this. Look at things without a purpose. Sit somewhere without a task. The busyness was deliberate. She had understood for a long time that if she stopped moving, certain things caught up with her, and she had developed elaborate professional machinery to make sure that didn't happen. But it was almost midnight, and the storm was beautiful in the way catastrophes sometimes are, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Her phone showed 2 missed calls from her mother, which she would return tomorrow. A text from her head of security confirming that the building was on overnight watch protocol. Nothing from anyone she actually wanted to hear from, which was not surprising, because the list of people she actually wanted to hear from was very short, and she had spent years making it shorter, cutting away everyone who had started to look at her with that specific mixture of pity and awkwardness that she couldn't tolerate. She had people who worked for her. She had her mother, who called twice a week and cried sometimes when she thought Celine couldn't tell. She had a physical therapist she liked, and an attorney she trusted, and a board of directors she was increasingly unsure about. She did not have anyone who knew what she sounded like when she was just talking, not managing, not deciding, not performing the particular brand of controlled competence that was the only version of herself she'd shown the world since the crash. She turned the chair slightly and looked down the hallway toward the mechanical room. She could just barely hear him still working. The occasional clank of tools, that same quiet humming, indistinct at this distance. She turned back to the window. "I'm so tired," she said very quietly, to no one. To the snow. Yeah. At 12:40, Jace wiped his hands on a shop rag, stood up from the floor, and pressed the test cycle button on the auxiliary panel. The system breathed to life. He could feel the pressure building in the lines, a healthy, steady climb, and the status light on the panel cycled from red to amber to a solid green. He held his breath for 30 seconds, watching the pressure readout. It held. He pressed the button again to initiate the full lift cycle. Down the hall, behind its brushed steel doors, the executive elevator began to move. He listened to it descend, hit the bottom, and come back up. Clean and smooth, no hesitation in the travel, no groaning in the hydraulics. He checked the pressure gauge one more time. Steady. He started packing his tools. He wasn't in a hurry. He worked the way he always worked, methodically, taking his time to put things back in order, making sure nothing was left out or out of place in the mechanical room. His father had taught him that. A mechanic's reputation was only partly about what he fixed. The other part was how he left things. He was loading the last of the tools into his bag when he heard her. He stopped. He almost wasn't sure he'd heard it right, because it was very soft. Barely a breath, really. And it seemed to come from somewhere just down the hallway, near the windows at the end of the conference wing. He'd walked past her office when he came in, and her door had been open. Had she come out again? He stayed still. His hand was on the zipper of the bag, and he didn't move it. The words came again, just slightly louder, the way someone's voice sounds when they're speaking to themselves without realizing they've drifted above a whisper. "I wish you were mine." The silence that followed was complete. Jay stayed exactly where he was for a long moment. He was not an emotional man in any demonstrative sense. He was someone who tended to feel things quietly and deal with them privately. But something about those 4 words and that particular voice and that particular silence landed somewhere in him that he hadn't expected. He had been a husband. He knew what loneliness sounded like when someone stopped pretending. He finished zipping his bag. He picked it up. He walked down the hallway to the door of her office, which was open, and knocked on the frame. She was at the window, her back to him. She turned around quickly, too quickly, and something moved across her face for just a fraction of a second before her expression settled into composure. "Mr. Holloway," her voice was completely even. "Is it done?" "Systems back up, full pressure, clean cycle." He kept his own voice neutral, matching her register. "Tested it twice, you should be good." "Excellent." She moved toward her desk. "Let me get Marcus to come up so we can discuss the invoice." "That's all right. I'll bill the standard emergency rate plus materials. Marcus has my contact for the paperwork." She stopped, turned her chair slightly to look at him. "That's all?" "That's all." A pause. She seemed to be reassessing something. "It's nearly 1 in the morning, Mr. Holloway. The storm is still—" "I'll wait it out in the lobby if it's too bad." He shifted the bag on his shoulder. "You should get some sleep, Ms. Ashcroft." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her eyes that she hadn't managed to put away quickly enough. Whatever had been there before he knocked, the unguarded version, the one that had whispered to the dark and the snow. He wasn't going to mention it. He hadn't heard anything, but he'd heard it. "Good night," he said. He went back down the hall, took the elevator, which ran clean and smooth and perfectly, and crossed the empty lobby without stopping. Marcus was at the security desk, half asleep, and startled awake when Jace set his bag down. "It's done," Jace said. "The solenoid's been replaced and the pump line is sealed. Tell her maintenance team to schedule a full hydraulic inspection in the next 30 days. There might be other valves on the same service cycle as that one. Marcus was writing it down. You got it. And Mr. Holloway? He looked up. Thank you. Genuinely. Jace nodded once. He pulled on his coat, pushed through the lobby door, and walked out into the storm. The wind hit him full in the face, cold and sharp, and carrying the specific scent of a Chicago winter at its worst. That wet metallic smell of ice and exhaust, and something faintly like lake water even though the lake was 3 blocks east. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the white. I wish you were mine. He'd heard it. He'd heard every word. He didn't know what to do with it yet. He put it somewhere quiet and started walking toward the loading bay where he'd left the truck. The storm was starting to ease slightly. The wind dropping just enough that the snow was falling more or less straight down now, thick and soft and relentless. He brushed 6 inches of accumulation off the hood of the truck, started the engine, and sat in the parking bay while it warmed up. Somewhere up on the 32nd floor, 32 stories above him, the lights in a corner office were still on. He thought about 3 kids in his house. Lily wanting to hear the sad voice. Cam, who was 8 and building something out of spare wire in the garage that he hadn't gotten around to asking about yet. Tomas, who was 11 and had recently started looking at Jace with this complicated expression that Jace recognized from his own adolescence. The look of a kid who was beginning to understand that adults were not the finished, settled creatures they appeared to be. He thought about his wife, Dana, the way she used to sit in the kitchen at night after the kids were down, just sitting, drinking tea she'd made too strong the way she always did. The particular quiet of a house when someone you loved was in it. He put the truck in drive. He didn't know what to do with the whispered words yet. He wasn't a man who moved fast on things like this, wasn't a man who confused a moment's vulnerability with an invitation. He was a mechanic from the north side who drove a truck with too many miles on it and went home to 3 kids who needed him to show up in the morning. But somewhere on the drive home, he thought, she sounded so alone. He stopped at a red light and watched the snow accumulating on the crosswalk lines until they disappeared entirely. He thought about how she'd sat in the dark watching the storm. He thought about the look on her face in that fraction of a second before she pulled her composure back around herself like armor. He thought about Dana, who had never once pretended to be fine when she wasn't. The light changed. He drove home through the white streets of Chicago while the snow kept falling. And when he got back at 2 in the morning, he checked the kids the way he always did. Lily curled into a corner of her bed like a question mark. Cam stretched flat on his back with one arm hanging off the side. Tomas sleeping on his stomach with his face turned toward the wall. He pulled Lily's blanket up. He retrieved Cam's arm from the floor and put it back on the mattress. He left Tomas's door the way he always did, open 2 inches because Tomas had been 12 when his parents died and did not like being behind closed doors at night, and Jace had never made him explain that and never intended to. He went to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. I wish you were mine. He held that for a while. Then he lay down, closed his eyes, and let the snow keep falling outside his window, and didn't think about it anymore, or tried not to. He was a practical man by nature. He fixed things. He did not speculate about what was unfixable, or what was none of his business, or what lived in the unguarded whisper of a woman he'd met 3 hours ago and would probably never see again. He had work in the morning. He had 3 kids who needed breakfast. He closed his eyes. The storm buried Chicago in 31 inches overnight, and in the morning the city was white and new and perfectly still. And the elevator on the 32nd floor of the Ashcroft Industries Tower ran smooth and clean on a hydraulic system that finally worked the way it was supposed to, carrying its CEO from her floor to the lobby and back again without a single fault, while the man who fixed it drove north on plowed streets in a truck that needed a new muffler, taking 2 kids to school and 1 to preschool, and stopping at the gas station on Addison for a large coffee he drank in the parking lot before heading to his first job of the day. Neither of them knew that what had broken that night wasn't just a machine. And neither of them knew yet that some things, once you've heard them in the dark, don't go quiet again. The invoice arrived at Ashcroft Industries on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the storm. It was straightforward to the point of being almost Spartan. Labor hours, parts cost, emergency call-out fee, all itemized cleanly without inflation. Celine had seen enough contractor invoices to know when someone was padding a bill, and this one wasn't. If anything, it was under what the work had warranted. The emergency rate alone could have been doubled given the conditions, and the solenoid valve he'd listed at cost was a part she knew ran higher from most suppliers. She approved it for immediate payment and told her accounts manager to add a 15% gratuity. Then she opened a new browser tab and typed in Holloway Mechanical Chicago. She told herself she was doing due diligence. The building had a maintenance contract up for renewal in the spring, and whoever had let that solenoid valve corrode for 18 months needed to be replaced. That was a legitimate business reason to look into alternative service providers. She told herself that for about 4 minutes, and then she stopped pretending. The business website was functional but not impressive, clearly built on a template, with a contact form and a list of services, and a single photo of a gray shop front on a street she recognized as being in the Avondale neighborhood. No staff bios, no press mentions. The About page had 3 sentences that read like someone had written them quickly and slightly reluctantly. Holloway Mechanical has served the Chicago metro area for 9 years. We specialize in commercial hydraulic systems, industrial elevator maintenance, and heavy equipment repair. Licensed, bonded, insured. That was it. No story, no founder's note, no LinkedIn-ready language about passion or mission. She found herself respecting that more than she expected to. She closed the tab. She opened it again 20 minutes later and wrote down the address. It took her another week to do anything with it, and she spent that week being annoyed at herself, which was an unfamiliar experience. Celine Ashcroft was not a person who dithered. She made decisions the way she did most things, quickly, with precision, and without extensive second-guessing. But this particular decision sat in a category she didn't have a clean framework for, and the absence of a framework bothered her more than the decision itself. What she finally settled on was this. The building's freight elevator had been making a sound, a low, intermittent grinding noise on the descent that Marcus had mentioned twice in passing. She had a legitimate need for a mechanical assessment. She was the CEO of a company with a building full of equipment. Calling a mechanic was not a personal act. She called the number on the website. He answered on the 3rd ring, and she recognized his voice immediately, even though she'd only heard it for a total of maybe 12 minutes. It had a particular quality. Unhurried, slightly rough, like someone who didn't talk more than he needed to. Holloway. Mr. Holloway, this is Celine Ashcroft. You repaired our executive elevator system during the storm last month. A brief pause. I remember. We have a freight elevator that's developed a noise on descent. A grinding sound, intermittent, started about 3 weeks ago, according to our facilities manager. I'd like someone to look at it. Another pause, slightly longer. She couldn't read it. I can come Thursday afternoon, 2 o'clock. Thursday is fine. Ask for Marcus at the service entrance. All right? She waited to see if he'd say anything else. He didn't. The line was quiet in a way that felt comfortable rather than awkward, which was strange given that there was nothing comfortable about this situation from her perspective. Thank you, Mr. Holloway. Sure, he said, and hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. She was aware that her pulse was slightly elevated, which she found irritating and also interesting in a clinical way, the way she'd learned to observe her own body's responses since the crash. Not as things she controlled, but as data points she noted. She set the phone down and went back to work. The freight elevator did have a grinding noise. Jace found it in 40 minutes. A worn guide rail bracket on the 3rd floor landing, metal-on-metal contact from a loose mounting that had been vibrating against the shaft wall. Simple fix, 45 minutes of work, parts he had in the truck. Marcus walked him through the building's service corridors while he assessed the problem, talking about the history of the place the way facilities managers always did, with the particular fondness of someone who understood a building's personality better than most of the people who worked in it. She bought it 8 years ago, Marcus said, meaning Celine. The whole building was in rough shape. Previous tenants had let a lot of systems run past their service life. She had everything overhauled in the first 2 years. Jace was looking at the guide rail, crouched in the service shaft doorway. Didn't do the freight elevator, apparently. That was before my time. Marcus leaned against the wall. She's particular about this building. Notices things most owners wouldn't. Last year, she flagged a water pressure variance in the north wing bathrooms that turned out to be a pinhole leak behind the wall. Maintenance had missed it for 6 months. Jace glanced up. She monitors the building systems herself? She has the diagnostic interface on her workstation. Checks it most mornings. Marcus said it without particular significance, just a fact about the person he'd worked for 4 years. Jace turned back to the rail. He thought about the amber light on the elevator panel that night, how she'd probably been watching it from her office. He thought about the conversation in the mechanical room, the way she'd asked him specific technical questions without any of the performance of someone pretending to understand something they didn't. She'd known what the solenoid valve was. She'd understood immediately what a pressure leak in the pump line meant for the system. He didn't say any of this to Marcus. He went back to his truck, got the bracket and the hardware he needed, and fixed the freight elevator in the time he'd estimated. He was packing up when Marcus appeared at his elbow. "Ms. Ashcroft would like to see you before you go." He looked up. "About the invoice?" She didn't say. She was in her office, but she wasn't at her desk. She was at the far end of the room by the windows, facing the city, and she turned when he came in with the particular controlled economy of movement he'd noticed before. Efficient, no wasted motion, the result of living for years in a body that required precision. "Mr. Holloway, how's the elevator?" "Fixed. Worn guide rail bracket on the third landing. It'll hold, but you should have the full shaft inspected. If that bracket wore down, the others are probably close." He paused. "I can write up a service recommendation if that helps." "Please." She looked at him steadily. She had a direct quality to her gaze that most people seemed to find uncomfortable. He'd noticed Marcus sometimes looked slightly to the side when she was watching him. Jace met it without difficulty. He wasn't sure why. "Can I ask you something personal, Mr. Holloway?" He was quiet for a moment. "You can ask." "Marcus tells me you drove here from Avondale in a blizzard at 9:30 at night last month, and you're here again on a Thursday afternoon fixing a freight elevator bracket." She paused. "Your work quality is exceptional. Why don't you have a corporate maintenance contract with a company like this one? You could be billing 10 times what you're charging us." He considered how to answer that. "I've had those contracts." "And?" "I don't like what they turn into. You end up doing things the client's way instead of the right way, because the contract is the relationship, and you don't want to lose the contract." He shifted his weight. "I'd rather stay small enough to do the work correctly." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between appraisal and something quieter. "That's an unusual position for someone running a business." "Probably." He picked up his bag. "The service report will come with the invoice. Marcus has my contact." "Mr. Holloway." He was halfway to the door. "Do you have a card?" He set the bag down, pulled his wallet out, and handed her the single business card he kept in there. Plain white, just the number and the company name. She took it without looking at it, which meant she was looking at him instead. He left before either of them said anything else that needed to be not said. The third call came 2 weeks later. This time, it was a problem with the building's security panel. One of the access control units in the executive wing had stopped communicating with the main server, leaving 2 keycard readers offline. It was not technically a hydraulic or elevator problem, but the card she'd given his number to said commercial systems and access control was a system. He came on a Wednesday morning. The fourth call was about a production line motor at the manufacturing facility in the Pilsen neighborhood, 30 minutes south of downtown, a different building entirely, but still under the Ashcroft Industries umbrella. That one was a real problem, a significant one. A 3-phase motor that had been running hot for weeks because someone had installed the wrong thermal overload relay during a previous service visit. It had nearly burned out. If it had, it would have taken the production line offline for days. He fixed it in an afternoon, wrote a detailed report about the incorrect relay and who had installed it, and sent it to Marcus along with the invoice. The 5th call was from Celine directly, not through Marcus. "The ventilation system in the server room is making a sound," she said when he picked up. "What kind of sound?" "Like a pause." He could hear her thinking. "Like a deck of cards being shuffled. Rhythmic. Gets louder when the system runs at capacity." "Fan blade," he said. "Probably debris caught in the housing. Could also be a bearing starting to go." "Can you come tomorrow?" He had 2 jobs already scheduled for tomorrow. "I can come at 7:30 in the morning." 7:30 is fine. He came at 7:30. The server room was on the 14th floor, and Celine was already there when he arrived, something he hadn't expected. It was not a space that required her presence. She had things she could be doing. She was there anyway, sitting near the door with a coffee cup and her laptop, ostensibly working. He didn't comment on it. The sound was exactly what he'd described. Debris in the fan housing, a small piece of plastic that had broken off a cable management clip and found its way through the intake. He had it out in 20 minutes. "Done already?" she said without looking up from her laptop. "It was debris. Easy fix." He was wiping his hands. "The bearing's fine. You'll want to check the cable management clips on the rest of the server racks. If one broke off, others might be degraded. I'll have IT check." She closed the laptop and looked at him. "You want coffee? There's a machine in the break room on this floor." He looked at her. This was a new thing. She'd never offered before. He was aware of what it meant, which was why he looked at her for a moment before answering. "Sure," he said. They sat in the break room with bad vending machine coffee and talked for 40 minutes, which was the longest he'd stayed in the building for reasons unrelated to actual work. She asked him about the types of systems he'd worked on over the years. He told her about a hydraulic press he'd rebuilt in a steel fabrication plant in Gary, Indiana, that had been running with incorrect pressure settings for so long that the operators had stopped noticing that the output was off by 12%. She asked how he'd known. He said the sound was wrong, that machines had a particular sound when they're running correctly and a different sound when they're not. And if you listened long enough, you learned the difference the way you learn the difference between someone who's breathing normally and someone who isn't. She was quiet for a moment after he said that. "Do you ever get it wrong?" she asked, listening to the sound. "Yes." He turned his coffee cup around in his hands. "More often at the start. Less often now, but yes." She nodded slowly, like this was the answer she'd expected and also the one she'd wanted. "Most people in your position would say no. Most people in my position would be lying." She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, see, more like something approaching one, a softening at the corners of her mouth that she pulled back slightly before it arrived fully. He noticed it. He was finding that he noticed most things about her that she didn't intend to show. They went back to their respective things after that. Him to his truck, her to whatever was on the 32nd floor waiting for her. He drove south on the expressway with the radio off and the window cracked despite the cold, the way he did when he was thinking about something he hadn't sorted out yet. He wasn't confused about what was happening. He was 32 years old and he had been paying attention to people his entire life, partly by nature, and partly because of what the last 6 years had taught him. He knew when someone was engineering situations for reasons that had nothing to do with the stated reason. What he didn't know yet was what he intended to do about it. He mentioned none of this to anyone, which was his default position on things that didn't have a clear answer. He mentioned very little to anyone in general. His crew, Danny, who was 26 and talked constantly, and Phil, who was 51 and talked slightly less constantly, had noticed that he'd been going downtown more often, but attributed it to a new commercial client, which was accurate enough that he didn't correct it. His neighbor Carol, who was 63 and had been watching his kids since before Lily was walking, noticed something different. Carol noticed everything, the way people who have raised 4 children of their own learn to notice things that other people walk past. "You're preoccupied," she said one evening when she came to get her casserole dish that she'd left after dropping off dinner 3 days earlier and that Jace had forgotten to return. "I'm tired," he said. "You're always tired." "This is different." She looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "Work?" "Something like that." She retrieved her dish. "The kid said you've been going downtown a lot." "Got a new client downtown." "Good client?" He was quiet for a moment. "Unusual client." Carol looked at him for a long moment with an expression that combined patience and perception in a way that reminded him, suddenly and unexpectedly, of his grandmother. "Jace." "Carol, when's the last time you had dinner with someone who wasn't under the age of 12? He didn't answer that, which was itself an answer. She nodded slightly, the way people do when they've confirmed something they already suspected, and left with her casserole dish without pushing it further. That was what he appreciated about Carol. She made her point, and then she stopped making it. He stood in his kitchen for a while after she left, listening to the sounds of the house. Cam in the garage with his wire project, Lily watching something on the tablet in the living room, Tomas upstairs doing homework with the particular energetic quietness of a kid who knew he was supposed to be studying. He thought about Dana the way he always did when he was standing in this kitchen, not with the acute grief of the early years, but with the worn, familiar ache of someone who has learned to carry something without being defined by its weight. She had been in this kitchen. She had made coffee in that machine and left her mug on the left side of the sink because she was left-handed, and it annoyed him slightly, and he had never said so. He still put the mug on the left side of the sink himself every morning without thinking about it. He wasn't sure what he owed to the memory of someone he'd loved. He didn't think Dana would have told him he owed it anything. She had been clear-eyed about things in a way that he'd sometimes found bracing when she was alive and missed deeply, now that she wasn't. "You can't fix everything by staying still," she'd told him once, about something else entirely. He thought about that sometimes. It was Phil who first mentioned something being off with the company's numbers, and he didn't mention it as a financial thing. He mentioned it as a logistical thing. They were doing a scheduled maintenance visit at the Pilsen facility, the third one since Jace had fixed the production line motor, and Phil was talking to one of the floor supervisors during a break. The kind of peripheral conversation that happens when a crew is working in a place regularly enough that the staff starts treating them like fixtures. The floor supervisor's name was Ruben, and he'd been with Ashcroft Industries for 11 years. He was a compact, deliberate man in his mid-40s who spoke with the specific authority of someone who knew exactly how everything in his building worked and was mildly contemptuous of anyone who didn't. "They shifted the maintenance budget allocation again last quarter," Ruben was saying to Phil, in the tone of someone complaining about something that was technically outside his job description but affected his job constantly. "Second time in 6 months. Equipment line gets cut. Facilities line gets cut. Meanwhile, I'm looking at orders that don't match production. We make it, but the numbers on paper don't add up." Phil made the agreeable noise he made when he was listening but thinking about something else. Jace, who was inside the motor housing and appeared to be concentrating on the drive coupling, was in fact listening to every word. "Who handles the budget allocations?" Jace asked without looking up. Ruben glanced over. "Executive level, CFO, and a couple of the board guys who have operational oversight. Davenport, Mercer. You know them?" "No? You're not missing anything." Ruben's voice had that flat, neutral quality that employees used when they were criticizing management without technically criticizing management. "Ms. Ashcroft, she's sharp. She knows production, but the financial stuff, the allocations, the overhead reports, those go through the executive layer first. She sees what they decide she should see." Jace came out of the motor housing and stood up. He looked at Ruben for a moment. "Say that again." Ruben shrugged. "I mean, there's a reporting structure. By the time it gets to her, it's been through 2 or 3 people. That's normal in big companies." "But you said the numbers don't match production." "I said that, yeah." Ruben looked at him with slightly more attention than before, recalibrating. "Why?" Jace picked up his wrench and went back to work. "No reason." But he was thinking about it for the rest of the afternoon, and on the drive back north, and that evening after the kids were in bed when he sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and tried to write down what he'd heard across 3 months of working in Ashcroft Industries facilities. The maintenance budget cuts that had let the solenoid valve corrode. The incorrect thermal overload relay that someone had installed without documentation. The production numbers that didn't match. The service contracts that hadn't been renewed on schedule. Individually, these things could be explained by ordinary institutional inertia, the specific laziness of bureaucracies, the gap between what decision-makers decided and what actually happened at floor level. Jace had seen that in enough companies to know it was common, but together, in a pattern, pointed at by a floor supervisor with 11 years in the building who noticed that the numbers on paper didn't add up. He drew a line on the notepad and stopped writing. It wasn't his business. He was a mechanic. He fixed equipment in this woman's buildings, and he was paid fairly for it, and whatever was happening in the executive layer of her company was not something he had standing to comment on. He tore the page off the notepad and folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure why he kept it. The next time he came to the downtown building, Celine was having a bad day. He could tell before she said a word. There was something in her posture that was different, a tightness across her shoulders that she didn't normally carry. She was at her desk when Marcus brought him up to look at a malfunctioning HVAC control panel in the executive wing, and she looked up when he passed her open door and said, "Mr. Holloway," in a voice that had something scraped down to the edges of it. "Ms. Ashcroft." He paused in the doorway. She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the February sky was the specific flat gray of a city winter that has stopped trying to be interesting. "The HVAC panel is at the end of the hall," she said. "I know. Marcus showed me." He didn't move. "You all right?" She looked startled, which he hadn't expected. Not offended. Startled, like someone who'd been asked a question in a language they weren't sure they still remembered. "Fine," she said. Then, a beat later, "No, not particularly." She said it like she surprised herself by saying it. "I have a board meeting Friday that I'm not looking forward to, and I've been in the chair for 11 hours because my morning appointment ran long, and I'm tired, and this is more than you asked." "I asked," he said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not the controlled composure, not the armor. Something underneath it that was just a person having a hard day, admitting out loud that it was hard. "The board meeting is going to be difficult," she said. "There are people on that board who think my being in this chair means I can't see things clearly." "Do they say that?" "They don't have to." Her voice was flat, not bitter. The flatness of someone who has been angry about something for so long that the anger has burned down to something harder. They say it with their questions. They say it with who they talk to after the meetings and before them. They have a way of making every discussion about the company's future sound like a discussion about whether I'm capable of being the person who leads it. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you?" She met his eyes. "Yes." "Then they're wrong," he said simply, "and I have a HVAC panel to look at." He went down the hall. He was aware that this was either the right thing to say or a significant overstep, and he didn't know which yet, but it was what he believed, and he wasn't capable of saying things he didn't believe just to smooth a moment over. When he came back 45 minutes later to report that the control panel had a faulty temperature sensor and would need a replacement part ordered, she looked more like herself. The armor back in place but less rigid than it had been, like someone who'd put it back on but left it slightly looser. "Thank you," she said, and he wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. "I'll have the part in 3 days," he said. "I'll call Marcus." "Call me," she said. He nodded once. "All right." He was in the elevator going down when he took the folded notepad page out of his jacket pocket. He looked at the list. He thought about a board meeting on Friday where men who believed a woman in a wheelchair couldn't see clearly would sit across a table from her and ask their particular kind of questions. He thought about production numbers that didn't match. He folded the page again and put it back in his pocket. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do with it. But he was starting to understand that doing nothing was also a choice, and not necessarily a neutral one. The elevator reached the lobby. He walked out into the February cold, turned his collar up, and went back to his truck. The temperature sensor part came in on a Wednesday, and Jason installed it Thursday morning while Celine was in a meeting downstairs. He knew she was in the meeting because Marcus mentioned it. Not casually, not like he was passing information deliberately, just the way facilities managers mention things about building occupancy when they're walking a technician through a space. "She'll be tied up until noon, probably longer. Quarterly operational review." Marcus said it with the careful neutrality of someone who had opinions about the quarterly operational review but had learned to keep them filed away. Jace replaced the sensor, recalibrated the zone controller, and tested the system through 2 full cycles before signing off on the work. He was in the service corridor collecting his tools when he heard voices from the conference room at the end of the hall. The large one, the one with the glass wall that looked out over the city on one side and a frosted interior partition on the other. He wasn't trying to listen. He was walking past. But he heard Celine's voice, and then he heard another voice, and the second voice had a particular quality that stopped him without him deciding to stop. "The Q4 projections, Ms. Ashcroft reference don't reflect the adjusted facility overhead," the voice said. Male, polished, the specific confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where his confidence was never questioned. "If we're working from the corrected figures," "Which figures?" Celine's voice. Controlled, but with that scraped-down edge he'd heard before. "The ones your office sent me last week? Or the ones that were sent to the full board?" A pause. They reflect the same data. They don't. Flat. Certain. The facility overhead in what you sent me is 14% lower than what went to the board. I'd like to know why. Another voice, softer, conciliatory. Celine, I think there may have been a formatting issue in how the documents were compiled. A formatting issue doesn't change the numbers, Richard. Jace stood in the service corridor for a moment. He wasn't visible through the frosted partition. He was just a man with a tool bag in a hallway, not moving. Then he moved. He went back to his truck, sat in the parking garage, and took the folded notepad page out of his jacket pocket. He unfolded it and looked at the list he'd written 2 weeks ago. Production numbers that didn't match, budget allocations that had been shifted twice in 6 months, maintenance contracts cut below the level that allowed proper upkeep, an incorrect part installed without documentation, and now financial figures that were different depending on who received them. He was a mechanic. He had no training in corporate finance, no experience with securities law, no framework for understanding what it meant when a CFO sent different numbers to the CEO and the board. But he had spent 9 years diagnosing systems, and the thing about systems, whether they were hydraulic or mechanical or organizational, was that the same principles applied. When multiple components were showing anomalous readings simultaneously, it wasn't coincidence, it was a symptom. He folded the page again. He thought about Ruben's voice. She sees what they decide she should see. He sat in the parking garage for a long time. Mastet. He didn't tell Celine what he'd heard in the hallway. Not that day, and not the following week when he came back to inspect the ventilation risers in the east stairwells, a job Marcus had requested, routine enough on its face. He needed more than a list of things that could each be individually explained away. He needed something that couldn't be explained away. The ventilation risers ran adjacent to the building's main data conduit, the physical infrastructure backbone that connected the server room on the 14 to the executive systems on 32. It was routine to access the riser housing from the conduit room on each floor, which meant that over 3 days of inspection work, Jace moved through nearly every mechanical and data infrastructure space in the building, which meant he saw things that the people who worked in the offices above never thought about. On the 18th floor conduit room, behind a ventilation housing that hadn't been opened in at least a year, based on the dust accumulation on the access screws, he found a secondary network device, a small, flat box, matte black, zip-tied to the conduit bracket in a way that was meant to look like it belonged there. It had a single blinking amber light and 2 Ethernet connections, one of which ran into the building's main data line. Jace had spent enough time in building systems to know what belonged and what didn't. This didn't belong. He didn't touch it. He photographed it with his phone, noted the location and the approximate cable routing, and closed the housing. He found 2 more on subsequent floors, 22 and 26, both in the same configuration, both with the same amber light, both connected to the building's data backbone. He didn't say anything to Marcus. He didn't say anything to anyone. That evening, he called his brother-in-law, a man named Greg, who had worked in IT infrastructure for 15 years and currently ran network security assessments for a regional bank. They talked for 40 minutes. Jace described what he'd found without saying where he'd found it. "Without seeing the hardware, I can't tell you exactly what they are," Greg said. "But the setup you're describing, secondary device, connected to the main data line, concealed behind existing infrastructure, that's a tap. Someone is intercepting data traffic on that network. Can you tell what data? Depends on the device. Could be everything, could be targeted. If I had the MAC addresses, I could tell you more." "How do you get the MAC address?" "You'd need to access the device's configuration interface, which means connecting to it." A pause. "Jace, where are you that there's something like this in the walls?" "Work site." "Whose work site?" He was quiet. "Jace." "I'll be in touch," Jace said, and hung up. He told Celine on a Friday afternoon 3 days later, and he told her in the way he'd decided to tell her, directly, without preamble, without softening the edges. He came up to the 32nd floor without a service reason, which was the first time he'd done that. He told the reception desk he needed to speak with Ms. Ashcroft about a building systems issue, which was technically accurate enough that he didn't feel bad about it. She was at her desk, and she looked at him when he came in with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read rooms quickly. She registered that something was different before he said a word. "Close the door," she said. He did. He sat down across from her without being asked, which he also hadn't done before. He put his phone on the desk between them with the photographs open. "I found these in your building's conduit rooms," he said. 18th, 22nd, and 26th floors. They're network taps, devices that intercept and copy data traffic on your internal network. She looked at the photographs without picking up the phone. Her expression didn't change the way he expected it to. There was no visible shock, no sharp intake of breath. What happened was more subtle. Her face went very still in a way that was distinct from her usual controlled composure. This was something else. This was the stillness of someone who has just received confirmation of something they already suspected but hadn't been able to prove. "How long have they been there?" she said. "I can't tell exactly. The dust accumulation on the housing suggested at least several months, possibly longer." She was quiet. She looked at the photographs again, then away from them, at a point somewhere past his shoulder. Her hands were flat on the desk. He noticed they were not quite steady. "The financial documents," she said, "the ones with the discrepancies. I heard part of your meeting last week. Not intentionally. I was in the service corridor." She looked at him. He met her eyes. "Tell me what you heard," she said. He told her. He told her about the conference room, about the different figures, about the voice with the decades of unquestioned confidence. He told her about Reuben, about the production numbers, about the maintenance budget cuts. He laid it out the way he laid out a diagnostic, component by component, in order, without editorializing. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Davenport and Mercer," she said finally. "Those are the two names you heard." The second voice was called Richard. "Richard Mercer." She said it without inflection. "He's been on the board for 6 years. He brought Davenport in as CFO." She paused. "I've been watching the numbers for 4 months. I knew something was wrong. But our audit function reports to the audit committee, and 2 of the 3 members of the audit committee are Davenport's people," Jay said. "Yes." She looked at him across the desk. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked tired in a way that wasn't about the hour or the physical weight of a long day in the chair. It was something deeper. "I brought an outside forensic accountant in 6 weeks ago, under the guise of an operational efficiency review. But if they've been monitoring my network communications, they may have known about it. They may have moved things before she could find them." Her jaw tightened slightly. "Or moved against me before I could move against them." He leaned forward slightly. "What does moving against you look like?" She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but opening slightly, the way a door opens when someone inside finally decides the person knocking is worth letting in. "There's a shareholder meeting in 3 weeks," she said. "Annual review. It's always contentious when the company has had a rough operational quarter. And this quarter has looked rough on paper, which is now less of a mystery." She paused. If they wanted to make a move on leadership, that meeting would be the place to do it. In front of the shareholders. With the shareholders. If they've spent the last several months making it look like operational performance is failing, and if they can present a narrative at that meeting about leadership deficiencies. She stopped. They'd need enough proxy votes. They've been cultivating that for months too, I think. Quiet conversations with institutional investors. The kind you can't prove unless someone decides to talk. The room was quiet. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in late February. Gray sky, wind off the lake. The specific colorlessness of a city waiting for spring that isn't coming yet. "The forensic accountant," Jay said. "Does she have anything so far?" "Some things. Not enough to take to a court or a regulatory body independently. She'd need access to the data that went through those devices." He looked at her steadily. "My brother-in-law does network security assessments." She looked back at him for a long moment. "That would expose him to significant risk if this goes legal." "I'll talk to him." "Jace." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He noticed it. He didn't think she noticed she'd done it. "This isn't your problem to solve." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He picked up his phone from the desk and stood. "But you told me in November that there are people on your board who think your being in that chair means you can't see things clearly." He looked at her. "You told me you could." I believed you. She held his gaze. Whatever they're planning, he said, they're planning it because they think you're not looking. Make sure you're looking. He left. In the elevator going down, he called Greg. Tomant. Greg came in the following week as a subcontractor on what was officially a network infrastructure audit for a building systems client. Paperwork that Jace's LLC signed off on. Liability that sat with him rather than with Celine or Ashcroft Industries. A legal structure that Greg's own attorney looked at and approved with some reservations. Greg spent 2 days in the conduit rooms with equipment that looked, to anyone passing through, like standard network diagnostic hardware. He was thorough and methodical and completely without drama, which was one of the things Jace had always liked about him. What he found was worse than either of them had expected. The devices weren't just passive taps. They were active intercept units with encrypted uplink capability, which meant they weren't just copying network traffic locally. They were transmitting it somewhere. Greg traced the uplink frequency to an external relay, which he couldn't follow further without involving law enforcement-grade tools. But what he could extract from the device logs, carefully, without disturbing the devices themselves, without leaving evidence that they'd been examined, was a timestamp record of active transmission periods. Those transmission periods correlated, with uncomfortable precision, to periods when Celine had been communicating with her outside forensic accountant. They knew about the audit, Greg said, sitting across from Jace at his kitchen table at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night, with his laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold beside him. The moment she initiated contact with the accountant, they had access to the communication. Jace sat with that for a moment. What about the financial data going through the network, the budget allocations, the reporting to the board? I can't pull the content of what was transmitted, but I have the records of what was accessed on the network during those transmission windows. File path names, access logs. He turned the laptop slightly so Jace could see the screen. These are financial report files being accessed and transmitted during periods when no one was logged into the executive system. Automated pulls. Someone set up scheduled data extraction. For how long? Greg looked at him. Best I can tell from the log timestamps, about 14 months. 14 months. Jace did the arithmetic in his head. 14 months of financial data being pulled from Celine's network and transmitted to someone outside the building. A year and 2 months of budget allocations, operational reports, board communications, accounting files, everything that flowed through the executive systems of Ashcroft Industries, being mirrored to people who could use it to construct whatever financial reality they wanted to present. I need you to compile everything you found into a format that an attorney can work with, Jace said. Already started. Greg closed the laptop. Jace, whoever put those devices in did it professionally. This wasn't a disgruntled employee with a flash drive. The hardware is commercial grade, the installation is clean, the uplink encryption is sophisticated. He looked at his brother-in-law. These are people with resources. I know. And they know the building. They had access to those conduit rooms without triggering any questions. I know that too. He thought about maintenance contractors, about service visits that weren't in the records, about a solenoid valve that should have been replaced 18 months ago but wasn't because the maintenance budget had been cut by people who controlled what the CEO saw. He thought about how easy it would be to put something in a wall if you were the person who was supposed to be maintaining that wall. He brought the documentation to Celine in person because it wasn't the kind of thing you emailed, and it wasn't the kind of thing you sent through a building whose network had been compromised for over a year. He brought it printed in a folder, and he drove it downtown himself on a Saturday morning when the building was quiet. She read through it at her desk while he stood by the window. She read the way she did most things, quickly, completely, without asking questions in the middle. When she finished, she set it down and was quiet for a long time. 14 months, she said. Yes. The proxy conversations with the institutional investors would have started around the same time. She looked at the documents again, not reading, just looking. They had my communications. They knew what I knew, when I knew it, what I was concerned about. Every strategic conversation I had through this network went to them. She put her hand flat on the documents. Her jaw was tight. He could see the effort of control in her face, not hiding the anger exactly, but containing it, the way you contain pressure that has nowhere productive to go yet. The shareholder meeting is in 11 days, she said. I know. My outside counsel needs to see this today. She was already picking up her phone. And the SEC has a financial fraud division. The documentation of the intercept devices and the correlation to the financial reporting discrepancies is enough to open a formal investigation. But that takes time we may not have before the shareholder meeting. What happens at the meeting if they get what they want? She set the phone down and looked at him directly. They table a motion to restructure executive leadership. They've been building proxy support for months. If they have enough votes, they don't need to wait for a regulatory finding. A shareholder vote can remove me from my own company while the legal process takes years. The room was quiet. What do you need? He asked. She looked at him for a moment with that expression he'd been seeing more often lately, the one that appeared when she forgot to be armored. I need them to have done this in front of witnesses, she said. I need the evidence in a form that a room full of investors can understand in real time, not in a regulatory filing that takes 6 months to process. He turned that over in his mind. The financial discrepancies. The 2 sets of documents, what you received versus what went to the board. Do you have both versions? Yes. My forensic accountant has documented the differences extensively. And the intercept logs Greg compiled, those established that the network was being monitored during the periods when those documents were generated and transmitted. Yes. So you have evidence that the financial information was manipulated and evidence that the manipulation was enabled by unauthorized surveillance of your own systems. He looked at her. Presented together in the right order to a room full of people who own shares in this company, it would need to be airtight, she said. One procedural problem and their attorneys make it inadmissible to the vote. Then make it airtight. He said it simply, the way he said most things. You have 11 days. She looked at him for a long moment. He saw it again, that approaching something, that almost smile that came and went before it fully arrived. But this time there was something different in it. Not just warmth, something more complicated and more honest. You're a mechanic from Avondale who came out in a blizzard to fix an elevator, she said. Still am. You have no idea what you've walked into. I have some idea. He picked up his jacket. Call your attorney. He was at the door when she said his name. He turned. She was looking at him across the length of her office. The city behind her, gray and wide and lit with the specific flat light of a late winter morning, all of it framed in those floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked like herself, he thought. Not the version she showed in meetings or in the press coverage he'd looked up once and then felt strange about looking up. Just herself. Tired and certain and not pretending to be anything other than what she was. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He left. The 11 days were not clean. Celine's outside counsel, a woman named Patricia Osei, who spoke in the rapid, precise cadences of someone who had litigated for 25 years and had no patience for imprecision, looked at Greg's documentation and told Celine it was usable, but that the chain of custody for the network evidence would be challenged. She spent 3 days working with Greg to formalize the documentation in a way that met evidentiary standards, which required Greg to revisit 2 of the conduit rooms with a licensed forensic examiner present. An additional layer of verification that ate 2 of the 11 days and cost more than anyone had budgeted. Celine's forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Dr. Farida Chen, who had been quietly building her case for 6 weeks, was able to correlate the network access logs with specific instances of document alteration, timestamps that showed financial files being accessed and modified during after-hours periods when no authorized user was logged into the system. It wasn't proof of intent in itself, but combined with the 2 sets of documents and the intercept device installation, it was what Patricia called a coherent evidentiary narrative. Meanwhile, Davenport and Mercer continued to prepare their shareholder meeting strategy with apparent confidence, which told Jace, who heard this secondhand through Celine, that they either didn't know they'd been found out yet or believed that what they'd prepared was sufficient to survive whatever response she mounted. He thought it was probably the latter. He thought they believed that the optics of a disabled CEO fighting a fraud allegation in the middle of a shareholder meeting would be complicated enough that even if she had documentation, the outcome of the vote would be uncertain. He thought they were counting on the meeting itself to do the work they hadn't been able to do through the numbers, To put her in a room in front of hundreds of investors and make it look like chaos, like weakness, like evidence that the narrative they'd been building for 14 months was correct. He thought about that a lot in the days before the meeting. On the evening before the shareholder meeting, Celine called him at 9 o'clock. He was in the garage trying to figure out what Cam had been building with the spare wire, which turned out to be a rudimentary circuit board of some kind that Cam refused to explain with the maddening privacy of an 8-year-old who didn't want to jinx something. He stepped outside to take the call. "Tomorrow morning," she said, 9 o'clock. "The venue is the Meridian Center on Wacker. There will be approximately 300 shareholders, institutional representatives, and press in that room." "I know, you sent me the details." "I know I did." A pause. She was quiet in a way that wasn't her usual composed quiet. "I keep going over the order of presentation in my head. Patricia says the evidentiary sequence is correct. Dr. Chen says the financial analysis will hold up to questioning. I've reviewed everything 4 times. And? And I'm afraid," she said, "not of the evidence. The evidence is solid. I'm afraid of the room." Another pause. "I've done hundreds of presentations. I've faced worse boards than this one. But this is—" She stopped. "Different," he said. "Yes. Because it's in front of people who've been told for 14 months that you're failing. Because I'm going to be sitting in that room in my chair while men who built their strategy around the assumption that I couldn't see clearly enough to catch them try to make 300 shareholders believe they were right." Her voice was even, but he could hear what was underneath it. Not fragility, nothing as simple as that. Something more complicated. The fear of a person who has been reduced to their limitations by other people so many times that they know, intellectually, that the evidence is solid, and still fear that the room will see what those people wanted them to see. He was quiet for a moment. "Celine," he said. Her first name. It was the first time he'd said it, and it landed in the space between them in a way they both registered. "Yes. You caught them," he said, "with 14 months of their own data, while they were watching you." He paused. "That's not what failure looks like." She was quiet on the other end of the line. He could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate, the way people breathe when they're getting a hold of something. "No," she said finally. "I suppose it isn't. Get some sleep. I'll try." A brief pause. "Are you coming tomorrow?" He hadn't been invited. There was no professional reason for him to be there. He was a mechanic who had found some things in some walls and had a brother-in-law who knew about networks. "I'll be there," he said. She said goodnight and hung up. He stood in the driveway for a moment, looking up at the February sky, which had gone clear for the first time in weeks. Stars were out over Chicago, which didn't happen often enough to take for granted. He stood and looked at them for a while. Then he went inside, told Cam to put the circuit board away, and got everybody to bed. The Meridian Center on Wacker was the kind of venue that corporate events used when they wanted to suggest both significance and transparency. A large, well-lit hall with a raised platform at the front, rows of seating that could accommodate several hundred, and a sound system that cost more than Jace's truck. He arrived at 8:15 and stood near the back while the space filled with the particular mix of people that significant corporate events attracted. Men in suits whose confidence was institutional rather than personal. Investor representatives with the careful eyes of people paid to be skeptical. A scattered number of journalists who had received Patricia Osei's press release the previous evening and were not sure yet what they'd walked into. He watched the room fill and thought about pressure systems, about what it meant when force built up with no release valve, about the specific moment in a failing hydraulic system when the pressure finally had somewhere to go. Davenport and Mercer arrived together, at the head of a group of board members, and took their seats on the platform. Davenport was in his late 50s, well-built in the preserved way of someone who took expensive care of himself, with the coloring of a man who spent winters in warmer places. Mercer was older, early 70s, white-haired and deliberate in his movements. They did not look like men who expected a difficult morning. Celine came in through the side entrance at 8:50, with Patricia Osei beside her and 2 of her most loyal senior directors behind. She moved through the room without hurry, without theatrics, the way she did everything, and found her designated position on the platform. Jace watched several of the institutional representatives track her across the room with the careful attention of people making assessments. She didn't look toward the back where he was standing. But just before the meeting was formally called to order, she looked up once, in his general direction, and whatever she found there, whether it was him specifically or simply the fact of another person in the room who knew what she knew and believed what she'd told them, something in her shoulders settled by a fraction. The meeting was called to order at 9 o'clock exactly. Mercer opened with a financial overview that Jace had been prepared for, but that still had a particular audacity to it. The smooth, practiced presentation of a narrative built on 14 months of manipulated data, delivered to a room that had no reason yet to doubt it. Production underperformance, elevated operational costs, leadership challenges in a period of strategic transition. Every phrase engineered to point at Celine without pointing at Celine, to let the implication do the work that a direct statement couldn't. He watched her listen. Her face was completely controlled. Her hands were still on the armrests of her chair. She gave Mercer nothing. When Mercer concluded and opened the floor for questions from institutional representatives, Patricia Osei stood up. "Before we proceed to questions," Patricia said, in the voice of someone who had spent 25 years making herself heard in rooms that preferred her quiet, Ms. Ashcroft would like to present additional materials pertinent to the board's financial overview. The room shifted slightly. Davenport leaned forward. What followed took 47 minutes. Celine presented it without raising her voice. She put the two sets of financial documents on the main screen, the version she had received from Davenport's office, and the version that had been distributed to the board. She let the room look at the differences. She did not explain them yet. She let 300 shareholders and their representatives sit with two documents that were supposed to contain the same data and visibly did not. Then Dr. Chen walked through the financial analysis, the systematic nature of the alterations, the timing, the pattern of modifications that consistently presented operational performance as worse than the underlying production data supported. Then Patricia presented the network intercept documentation, the devices, the access logs, the transmission records. She put Greg's forensic report on the screen alongside the timestamp correlations, and she presented it the way she'd told Jace she would present it, as a coherent evidentiary narrative, each element linked to the next, no gaps that a good attorney could drive something through. The room, which had been the specific kind of formal quiet that corporate events maintained by convention, became a different kind of quiet. Davenport attempted to speak twice. Patricia addressed his interruptions the way a person addresses a slow leak in a tire, acknowledging the sound without stopping for it. Mercer went completely still. Jace watched from the back of the room. He was watching the moment when the pressure finally had somewhere to go. He was watching it move through 300 people simultaneously, the shift from uncertainty to comprehension to something harder. The specific expression of institutional investors understanding that they had been given false information about an asset they owned, which was not an abstract concern for them, but a very concrete one. The questions, when they came, were not the questions Davenport and Mercer had prepared for. And then the lift broke. It happened during a brief recess, a 15-minute break that Patricia had requested to allow the room to process the documentation before proceeding to the formal motion session. The platform had been designed with an integrated accessibility lift for the staged area, a standard addition for a venue that hosted public events. Celine had used it to get onto the platform at the start of the meeting. When the recess ended and Celine moved to return to her position on the platform, the lift was not responding. Marcus would tell Jace later that the power to the lift's control unit had been cut at the building's secondary distribution panel. A clean cut, not a malfunction, not a tripped breaker. Someone had physically interrupted the circuit, the same kind of someone who installed network intercept devices in conduit rooms while appearing to perform routine maintenance. The room saw it happen in real time. 300 people watched the lift fail to respond. They watched Celine press the control panel button twice, calmly, without visible distress, and then lift her hand away from it and sit without moving. Jace was already coming forward from the back of the room before he'd made a conscious decision to move. He came through the seating, past the institutional representatives, up to the edge of the platform. He looked at Celine. "Tell me what you need," he said quietly. She looked at him, then at the platform. About 18 inches of elevation, her chair, the logistics of it. She had done the math already. He could see her doing it. "The armrest lock," she said, equally quiet. There's a lever on each side. You'd need to... Show me. She showed him. He engaged the armrest locks, confirmed the brake, and then lifted both Celine and the chair together with the steady, unhurried care of someone who trusted his own strength without needing to announce it. He set them down on the platform level, made sure the chair was stable, and stepped back. It took perhaps 20 seconds. He stepped back down to the floor level. In the audience, nobody was talking. Celine straightened in her chair. She adjusted the microphone. She looked out at 300 shareholders in a room that was so quiet that the air conditioning was audible. As I was saying, she said, in a voice that did not shake by a fraction, the motion we'll be considering today is not about operational performance. It's about whether this board, in its current composition, represents the interests of the people in this room. She looked at Davenport. He looked back at her with the expression of a man watching something he had planned for a year come apart in 47 minutes. I believe the evidence establishes that it does not, she said. Two of the institutional representatives began typing on their phones before she finished the sentence. The vote was not close. 271 shareholders in favor of removing Davenport, Mercer, and 3 affiliated board members from their positions. 19 abstentions. The remaining votes split between people who hadn't yet processed what they'd seen and 2 institutional representatives who voted against, out of what Patricia Osei later described as reflexive contrarianism, rather than any coherent position. Davenport's attorney attempted to file an emergency injunction that afternoon to halt the board restructuring. A federal judge denied it by 5 o'clock on the same day, citing the documented evidentiary record that Patricia had spent 11 days making airtight. By 6 that evening, the SEC had formally opened an investigation into financial fraud and unauthorized network surveillance at Ashcroft Industries, with Davenport and Mercer named as primary subjects. The arrest came 4 days later on a Tuesday morning, with the particular quiet efficiency of federal action that has been thoroughly prepared in advance. Jace heard about it from Marcus, who called him about an unrelated HVAC issue and mentioned it almost as an afterthought, the way you mention weather when you're really calling about something else. Because Marcus had been in the building that morning and had watched 2 federal agents walk through the lobby with the kind of posture that meant they were not there for a meeting. Jace was under a compressor unit in a restaurant kitchen in Wicker Park when the call came in. He finished what he was doing before he listened to the voicemail. He sat on an upturned milk crate in the back corridor of the restaurant and listened to Marcus's voice describe it, and then he sat there for a moment doing nothing in particular. He thought about the blizzard, about an amber light on a building panel, about a whisper in a dark hallway that was never meant to be heard. He went back to the compressor. Celine did not call him for 9 days after the shareholder meeting. He noticed this the way he noticed most things, without drama, without assigning more meaning to it than it warranted. She was managing the aftermath of a corporate fraud exposure and a board restructuring and a federal investigation, all simultaneously, while also continuing to run a company. He knew what that looked like from the outside. He imagined from the inside it was several times more consuming. He went back to his regular work. He repaired a loading dock lift in Bridgeport and a refrigeration system in a food processing plant in Cicero, and a hydraulic press in a metal fabrication shop in Gary, which was the same shop where he'd found the incorrectly set pressure values years ago and which now ran correctly because he'd fixed it and told them to check the settings quarterly. He picked Lily up from preschool on the days Carol couldn't and listened to 20-minute detailed accounts of what everyone in her class had done at lunch. He told Tomas that the expression on his face when he was thinking hard made him look like a detective, and Tomas looked at him with that complicated 11-year-old expression and said, "What kind of detective?" And Jay said, "A good one," which seemed to be the right answer. He did not look at his phone more than usual. He was replacing a gate valve in a boiler room in Lincoln Park on the 9th day when she called. "I owe you a conversation," she said when he picked up. He sat on the floor next to the boiler, back against the wall. "How are you doing?" A pause that told him the question caught her slightly off guard, which meant that most of what she'd been fielding for the past 9 days had been logistical rather than personal. "I'm functional," she said, which was honest in a way that most people wouldn't have been. "It's been a significant 9 days. I heard about Tuesday morning. It was..." She paused again. "It was necessary. It was correct. I'm not sure I've fully processed it yet." "You don't have to have processed it yet." "No, she agreed. I don't. A quieter pause. I'd like to see you. Not about the building, not about anything professional. She said the last part with the slight deliberateness of someone who has chosen words carefully and is committing to them. I think you've earned a conversation that isn't about systems failures. He looked at the gate valve. He thought about 9 days of not looking at his phone more than usual. I know a place on Damon that does good coffee, he said. Not the kind of place you probably go. What kind of place is it? Counter service. 8 tables. Cash only on Wednesdays. For some reason, nobody there seems to be able to explain. She was quiet for a moment. He thought he heard something close to a real smile in it. Not the approaching smile he'd catalogued over months, but something that actually arrived. That sounds fine, she said. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. Saturday morning, she confirmed. He hung up and went back to the gate valve. The coffee place on Damon was called Kettle Black, which was either a reference to the idiom or a reference to the color of their cold brew, and the owner, a man named Desmond who had been running it for 11 years, had opinions about both interpretations that he would share if asked, and sometimes if not asked. The tables were small and slightly uneven, and the floor had a lip at the entrance that Jace had not previously had reason to think about. He arrived at 8:50 and talked to Desmond about the lip. Desmond got a rubber threshold ramp from the back. He had one, it turned out, for a regular customer who hadn't been in for a few months, and they put it down without discussion. Jace moved one of the corner tables to a position that gave more room on one side, and Desmond raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. Celine arrived at 9:02 in a car he didn't recognize, driven by someone he also didn't recognize, a quiet, competent-looking woman in her 40s who pulled to the curb, helped with a collapsible ramp from the car to the sidewalk with the practiced ease of someone who had done it thousands of times, and then got back in the car and stayed there without being asked. Celine came in through the door and over the threshold ramp and looked at the corner table with the extra room on one side. And then she looked at Jace, and he could see her register both things, the ramp, the table, without saying anything about either of them. Coffee, he said, instead of anything else. Please. He got 2 cups from Desmond, who had, uncharacteristically, nothing to say about the idiom interpretation this morning, and brought them back. He sat down across from her. The table was small enough that they were closer than they'd ever been in her office, which had a desk between them, or in the building corridors, which had professional context built into them. Here there was just a small, uneven table and 2 cups of coffee, and the particular Saturday morning quiet of a neighborhood place where the other 6 occupied tables contained people minding their own business. You look tired, he said. I am tired. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Her hands were steady today. I've slept approximately 22 hours in the past 9 days. That's bad math. I know. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. How are your kids? He registered the question, not because it surprised him that she asked, but because of how she asked it. Not with the polite performance of someone making conversation about a topic they know exists. With the particular attention of someone who actually wanted to know. Lily has decided she wants to be a veterinarian, he said, or a bus driver. She hasn't narrowed it down yet. How old is she? 5? She has time. She does. He drank his coffee. Cam is building something in the garage that I've been told I'm not allowed to ask about yet. Tomas is 11 and recently figured out that adults are not, in fact, finished products. He's taking it better than most people do. Celine looked at him for a moment. You adopted all 3? Yes. After your wife. He held her gaze. After Dana. Yes. She was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, but the silence of someone who is taking something seriously. That's not a small thing, she said. No. Were they together before, the 3 of them? Cam and Lily are siblings and same biological family, came into the system together. Tomas was separate. He was 9 when he came to us. Dana had been pushing for a 3rd before. He paused. Before the accident, so when Tomas's situation came up, it seemed clear. How long after? Dana died in April. Tomas moved in October. He said it simply, the way he'd learned to say it. Not because it was simple, but because simplicity was how he'd learned to carry it without dropping everything else. It was probably the best thing I did in that year. He needed somewhere to be, and we needed someone who needed us. Celine was looking at him with an expression that he couldn't categorize. It wasn't pity, which he'd become expert at identifying and which was absent here, and it wasn't admiration exactly, which always made him uncomfortable. It was something quieter, something that looked like recognition. I had a chief of staff who came to visit me in the hospital after the crash, she said. He stayed for 2 hours and then told me he was accepting a position with another company. He said, she paused. He said he wanted to be honest with me about his career priorities while I was figuring out mine. Jace looked at her. He quit while you were in the hospital. He was very polite about it. Her voice was dry, but not all the way. Underneath the dryness was something that hadn't entirely healed. Over the next 6 months, I had 3 more senior people make similar decisions. Some were more polite about it than others. And the ones who stayed. The ones who stayed were mostly people who stayed for the company, not for me specifically, which is appropriate. That's what employees do. But it meant that the experience of the crash and recovery was... She stopped, started again differently. I went through the hardest thing I've ever been through without anyone to talk to who didn't either work for me or feel guilty about me. Your mother, he said, remembering the missed calls he'd heard about in passing. My mother calls twice a week and cries when she thinks I can't tell. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. She loves me enormously and has no idea what to do with who I am now. I think she's still waiting for me to recover into something closer to who I was before. And who were you before? She looked at him directly. More or less the same, but with the ability to walk into a room unannounced and stand at a window and not have everyone in the room track my arrival across the floor. She paused. The wheelchair doesn't bother me the way people assume it does. What bothers me is what it does to other people, and what I then have to manage on top of everything else. He nodded slowly. He understood that, not from the same place, but from the adjacent place of being someone who had experienced a loss so visible that it changed how every room responded to him for years after. The way people were careful, the way conversations had a slight lag in them, an extra beat of calculation, the way care could feel like surveillance. The kids don't do that, he said. Track you, I mean. She looked slightly puzzled. I haven't met your kids? I know. He said it without elaborating. She looked at him for a moment and understood the implication without him needing to make it explicit, which was one of the things about her that he'd stopped being surprised by and had started simply appreciating. No, she said quietly. I don't imagine they would. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, Damon Avenue was doing its Saturday morning thing. Slow traffic, a woman walking 2 large dogs with the resigned expression of someone who had agreed to this before fully thinking it through. A delivery truck idling in a loading zone while the driver checked his phone. Chicago, between winter and spring. Not beautiful yet, but no longer brutal. The kind of morning that exists in the gap between one thing and the next. I want to offer you a position, Celine said. Director of Facilities Infrastructure. It's a legitimate role. I've been meaning to create it for 2 years because the gap in our maintenance oversight was a real operational problem even before I understood it was being exploited. It comes with a salary, benefits, an office that doesn't have a boiler in it. He looked at her. I know what you're going to say, she said. Do you? You're going to say you don't want an executive title, that it changes what you are in a way you're not interested in, that the arrangement we have works because it has a certain... She paused. Distance built into it. He was quiet for a moment. Is that what you think the distance is for? She held his gaze. Tell me what it's for. It's not for what you think. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I'm not keeping distance because I'm not interested, Celine. I'm keeping it because you've had people in your life make decisions about who you need without asking. I didn't want to be another one of those people. The room was quiet enough that they could hear Desmond grinding beans behind the counter. She looked at him for a long time. He let her. And if I told you what I need, she said finally, then I'd listen, he said, and I'd tell you what I need. And we'd go from there like 2 people who are not sure what they're doing but are going to do it anyway. She looked at him. Something moved in her expression. Not the almost smile this time, not the approaching version. The actual thing. quiet and real and slightly crooked, like something that hadn't been used in a while and was finding its way back. "I need someone who talks to me like a person," she said, "who doesn't recalibrate every sentence for what I might need to hear. Who shows up when things are broken and doesn't make it about anything other than fixing them." She paused. "I need to not be alone in the particular way I have been alone for the past 2 years." "Okay," he said. She blinked. "Okay? That's manageable." He finished his coffee. "Keep the director title. I'll do the building's work under the existing arrangement, and you can fill the director role with someone who actually wants the office." He paused. "And I'll bring the kids to the charity event your foundation is doing next month. Lily's been asking to go somewhere that isn't her preschool or my shop, and Tomas does better in new situations when there's something specific to do." She looked at him. "How do you know about the charity event?" "Marcus mentioned it." "Marcus mentions a great deal." "He does," Jace agreed. "It's useful." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her processing it, not the offer, which she'd accepted in the same second he made it, but the specific nature of what it meant. Not a title, not a contract, not a clean, bounded professional arrangement with defined parameters. Something messier and less certain and considerably more real. "I haven't spent time with children since I was 1, she said. "I know, it's obvious." She raised an eyebrow. "That's rude." "It's honest. There's a difference." He stood to get refills. "You'll figure it out. Lily will make it easy." She introduces herself to everyone and then immediately shows them a drawing of whatever animal she's currently interested in. This week, it's axolotls. "What's an axolotl?" He looked at her. "You're going to have to ask Lily that. She'll tell you for approximately 40 minutes. The charity event was the Meridian Children's Foundation Gala, different venue, same name as the shareholder meeting location, which struck Jace as either coincidental or someone's idea of a statement. It was held in the 3rd week of March, in the specific transitional weather that Chicago produced between winter and spring. Cold enough for a coat, but with a quality to the light that suggested things were changing. Celine had been asked to speak, as one of the foundation's major donors, and she had agreed months before the shareholder meeting, back when her calendar had been less complicated. She almost canceled twice, according to Marcus, who relayed this with the particular care of someone who was not taking sides but wanted Jace to have information. She didn't cancel. He brought all 3 kids. This required Carol, who came over at 4 in the afternoon to help with what she described as the production phase. Getting 3 children into appropriate clothing without casualties. Lily had opinions about her dress that required 40 minutes to resolve. Cam wore his good jeans without complaint, but kept wandering back to the garage until Jace physically collected him. Tomas, who understood the stakes better than his younger siblings, was ready on time and spent the waiting period watching the others with an expression that was half exasperation and half fondness. "Who is she?" Tomas asked, while they were in the truck heading downtown. He asked it in the careful, precise way of an 11-year-old who had been thinking about a question for a while before deciding to ask it. "A client," Jay said. "A client we're going to a fancy event for. She invited us. It's a charity thing, for kids who've lost parents." Tomas was quiet for a moment. In the back, Lily was explaining axolotls to Cam, who had given up pretending not to be interested. "Is she, important to you?" Tomas asked. Jace drove for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "She is." Tomas absorbed this with the gravity of someone for whom the information was significant. "Okay," he said, and turned to look out the window at the city. The event was formal in the way Jace had expected. White tablecloths, a lot of carefully lit signage, people in clothes that cost more than his monthly shop lease. He felt the specific mild discomfort of someone who was correctly dressed for an occasion, but whose frame of reference for the occasion was limited, and he filed it away and didn't let it become anything more significant than discomfort. Lily lasted approximately 4 minutes before she escaped from the check-in area and introduced herself to a woman in a red dress, who turned out to be on the foundation's board of directors, and who took it considerably better than most adults did when approached by an unsupervised 5-year-old. Celine found them 20 minutes in. She came through the room in the particular way she'd come through every room he'd watched her move through, without performance, without the particular self-consciousness that people sometimes developed in formal spaces, with the calm economy of someone whose relationship with their own body and how others responded to it had long since settled into something functional rather than fraught. She was wearing something dark, understated, and she'd done something with her hair that he was aware of noticing and filed away without comment. She looked at the three kids in front of him. "This is Tomas," Jay said. "Cam, and wherever Lily has gotten to, He turned around. Lily was still with the woman in the red dress, now apparently showing her something on a piece of paper that she had produced from somewhere Jace didn't want to ask about. "That's Lily." Celine looked at each of them with the direct, unperforming attention he recognized, the same quality she brought to reading financial documents or assessing building systems, the real thing rather than the social version of it. Tomas met her gaze with the complicated wariness of an 11-year-old who was in the process of deciding whether to trust someone. Cam looked at her wheelchair with the frank curiosity of an 8-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend he wasn't looking. "Is that electric or manual?" Cam asked. "Cam," Jace said. "It's electric," Celine said, without any change in expression. "The motor is under the seat. The control is here." She indicated the joystick. Cam leaned forward with the expression of someone looking at a particularly interesting piece of machinery. "Do you want to see how it works?" Cam looked at Jace. Jace gave him the slight nod that meant fine. Cam looked back at Celine. "Yeah." She spent 10 minutes explaining the drive system to an 8-year-old with the same seriousness she brought to explaining financial discrepancies to a room full of shareholders, which was either one of the most unusual things Jace had ever seen at a charity gala, or simply Celine being Celine. Cam asked questions that were more technically specific than she'd expected, about the battery capacity, about how the motor handled inclines, about whether there was a regenerative braking system. And she answered all of them and then said, "How do you know about regenerative braking?" "I'm building a circuit board," Cam said. "In the garage. Dad doesn't know what it's for yet." "I know you're building something," Jace said. "I don't know what." "It's a motor controller," Cam said, as if this were obvious. "For a small electric vehicle. I'm going to show you when it's done." Jace looked at his son. He thought about the spare wire and the mystery and 45 minutes he'd spent trying to figure out what Cam was making. "How long have you been building a motor controller?" "Since January." Cam looked at Celine. "Do you know about motor controllers?" "I know enough," she said. She glanced at Jace with an expression that was very nearly amusement. "He's going to be trouble." "He already is," Jace said. Lily came back to them eventually, clutching a pamphlet about the foundation that she was using as a portfolio for her drawings, which she had apparently been distributing to attendees. She stopped in front of Celine and looked at her with the complete, unguarded assessment of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned that staring was impolite. "You have cool wheels," Lily said. "Thank you," Celine said. "Does it go fast?" "When I need it to." Lily considered this. Then she held up the pamphlet. Inside was a drawing of what appeared to be a salamander with extremely large external gills and an expression of mild concern. "Do you know what this is?" "An axolotl," Celine said. Lily's face underwent a transformation of complete delight. She turned to Jace. "Daddy, she knows what it is." "I heard," Jace said. Lily turned back to Celine with the expression of someone who had found an unexpected ally. "Most grown-ups don't know," she said in a tone of profound solidarity. "They say, 'What's that?' and then you have to explain everything." "I'd like to hear you explain it anyway," Celine said. Lily needed no further encouragement. Jace stood back slightly and watched his daughter explain axolotl regenerative biology to Celine Ashcroft with the earnest precision of a 5-year-old who had memorized a children's science book, and he watched Celine listen, actually listen. Not the performance of adult attention that children could always identify, but the real kind, asking follow-up questions, looking at the drawing, responding to the information rather than the performance of delivering it. Tomas appeared at his elbow. "She's not what I expected," Tomas said quietly. "What did you expect?" A pause. "I don't know. Somebody different." He watched Celine and Lily for a moment. "She listens like you do, like she actually cares what's being said." Jace looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "She does." She spoke at the event and she was good at it. Not the polished emptiness of someone who had given enough speeches to perform sincerity, but the specific gravity of someone who said what she meant and trusted the room to receive it. She talked about the Foundation's work without talking about herself, and the one personal thing she said was brief and unvarnished, that she had learned in the past 2 years that the hardest kind of loss was the kind that changed the terms on which you understood yourself, and that watching children navigate that kind of loss and come through, it was one of the few things that reliably reminded her what resilience actually looked like, as opposed to what people called resilience when they meant stoicism. Jace heard Tomas, beside him, go very still at that sentence. He didn't say anything about it. He just put his hand briefly on the back of Tomas's shoulder, the way he did sometimes, and Tomas leaned into it slightly without moving or looking up. After the speeches and before the dinner, Celine came and found them at their table, and she sat with them for 2 hours that had the particular texture of time that goes faster than it should. Cam drawing circuit diagrams on a cocktail napkin to show her the motor controller concept, Lily asleep in Jace's lap by 9:30 with the abruptness of a 5-year-old who has simply used up all available energy, Tomas asking Celine careful questions about how companies worked with the deliberateness of someone who was not making small talk but was genuinely trying to understand something. At one point, while Cam was showing her the napkin diagram and explaining the control logic, Tomas leaned slightly toward Jace and said, very quietly, "She knows how to talk to people. Like actually talk. Not like how most adults talk to kids. She's good at figuring out what's actually there," Jace said, equally quiet, "instead of what she expects to be there." Tomas looked at her for a moment, then at his father. "Is she going to be around more?" Jace looked at his son, at the complicated, careful expression of a kid who had learned to ask this kind of question without making it sound like the question it was, which was, not is she going to be around more, but is this safe to want? "Yes," Jace said. Tomas nodded once, with the deliberate containment of someone managing hope carefully. Then he turned back to the conversation about motor controllers, and that was that. Chop. She started coming to Avondale on Saturdays. Not every Saturday. Her schedule did not permit every Saturday, and she was honest about that rather than making promises she'd have to revise. But most Saturdays, by mid-April, her car would pull up in front of the house on the street with the oak tree that still hadn't leafed out yet, and the neighbor's lawn ornament that Lily had named Gerald, and she would come in with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had decided a place was safe and stopped performing her arrival. The first time, Lily met her at the door and handed her a drawing of an axolotl that she had prepared in advance. The second time, Cam showed her the partial motor controller in the garage, with the specific focus of a child who has decided someone is worth showing a real thing to. The third time, Tomas, who had been operating on a careful policy of friendly neutrality, came into the kitchen where she and Jace were drinking coffee and sat down and said, without preamble, "Can I ask you something about the fraud case? For school, we're doing a thing on business ethics." Celine looked at him. "Yes, but did you know something was wrong before Jace found the devices?" "I suspected something was wrong," she said. "I had evidence that something was wrong. I didn't have a way to make it visible enough to act on." "Why not?" "Because the people who were doing it controlled what information I received. They made sure I was looking at a version of reality they'd prepared for me." She paused, which is why someone who came in through a different door entirely, someone who wasn't part of the information structure they'd built, was able to see things I couldn't. Tomas thought about that. So it mattered that he was an outsider. It mattered that he was looking at the actual systems instead of the reports about the systems. She glanced at Jace. "There's a difference." Tomas looked at his father with an expression that Jace couldn't entirely read, but that felt significant. "Yeah," Tomas said. "There is." He stood up. "Thanks." He took an apple from the bowl on the counter and went back upstairs, and that was the end of the business ethics consultation. Celine looked at Jace. "He's going to be all right," she said. "I know." He refilled her coffee. "He's been all right for a while. He just doesn't fully believe it yet." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," she said. He looked at her. He understood that she meant it, not as a metaphor, not as empathy speak, but as a literal statement about her own experience. He thought about a woman who had survived a crash that should have killed her, who had rebuilt a company while learning a body she'd never expected to have, who had spent 2 years watching people around her recalibrate their expectations of what she was capable of, and had responded by being capable of more than any of them anticipated. He thought about how long it took to believe you were going to be all right when the evidence was still accumulating. "You will be too," he said, "in case that's still a question." She looked at him across the kitchen table in his house in Avondale, with the Saturday morning coming through the window and the sound of Cam in the garage and Lily singing something to Gerald, the lawn ornament, from somewhere in the front yard. "It's less of a question than it was," she said. He nodded. That was enough. The antique music box had been sitting on the corner of Celine's credenza since before Jace had ever set foot in the building. He'd noticed it the first night, the night of the blizzard, when he'd walked past her open office door on his way to the mechanical room. It was small, dark wood, ornate in the way of things made before ornamentation became unfashionable, with a hand-painted panel on the lid that showed a winter landscape he couldn't make out clearly from the hallway. He'd noticed it the way he noticed most things, without stopping, cataloging it peripherally, filing it away without knowing why. Over the months he'd been in that office, he'd registered it each time. It was always in the same position, always closed, always with a quality of deliberate stillness that distinguished it from the other objects on the credenza. The framed documents, the small succulent that Celine forgot to water and then remembered in bursts, the external drive she kept meaning to label. Everything else on that surface was functional or incidental. The music box was neither. He asked about it on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, when he was in the office recalibrating a thermostat sensor, and Celine was at her desk working through what appeared to be a dense legal document with the focused attention of someone who had learned to read very boring things very quickly. "The box on the credenza," he said. "Does it work?" She looked up. "No." A pause. "It hasn't worked since I had it. My grandmother left it to me. It worked when she had it. Something happened in the move, and I've never had it looked at." "What kind of mechanism?" She looked at him for a moment. "I have no idea. I assumed it was beyond repair. It's been sitting there for 6 years. He crossed to the credenza and picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. Dense hardwood, probably walnut, with brass fittings at the corners. He opened the lid. The interior was lined with faded burgundy velvet, and the mechanism was there, a cylinder and comb assembly, the classic design, with a small hand-painted note on the inside lid in a handwriting that was not Celine's. "For when you need to hear something beautiful." Beneath that, in the same hand, Paralyzed. He tilted the cylinder slightly and looked at the pins. Several were bent. One of the comb tines was misaligned, sitting at an angle that would prevent it from vibrating correctly. The spring looked intact. "It's not beyond repair," he said. She was watching him from her desk with an expression that had stopped being about the thermostat sensor. "You can fix a music box." "I can fix mechanical things." "A music box is a mechanical thing." He set it down carefully. "I'd need to take it to the shop. I don't have the tools for comb work here, but yes." She looked at the box. He could see something move in her face. Not the armor shifting, but something underneath the armor. Something older and quieter than the professional composure she wore in this room. "My grandmother used to play it every Sunday morning," she said, "before anyone else in the house was awake. I used to come downstairs and find her at the kitchen table, and she'd have the box open and she'd just be sitting with her coffee listening to it." She paused. "I haven't heard it play since I was 14. He picked the box up again. "I'll bring it back when it's done." She nodded without saying anything else, and he was fairly certain that if he'd looked at her directly at that moment, he would have seen something she'd prefer he didn't. So he didn't look, just carried the box to where his bag was and set it down carefully and went back to the thermostat. It took him 3 weeks. Not because the repair was especially complicated. The bent pins he could straighten with the right tools. The comb tine was a matter of precise realignment. The spring tension needed adjustment but was intact. But because he'd looked up Paralyzed on the cylinder and found that 2 of the pins were missing entirely, which meant the passage they played would have a gap in it, a silence where there should be sound. Sourcing replacement pins for a cylinder of that age and configuration required contacting 2 specialty suppliers, one of whom was in Germany and operated on a timeline that was best described as unhurried. He ordered the pins. He waited. He did the other repairs, and then waited for the pins. When they finally arrived, he spent an evening at the workbench in his shop with a magnifying glass and a pin vise, setting each one at the precise height and angle the cylinder required, testing after each one with a fingertip against the comb to hear if the pitch was right. Danny came in around 7 to get a tool he'd left behind and found Jace at the bench in the quiet shop and stood in the doorway for a moment. "What is that?" "Music box." "Whose?" "Clients." Danny looked at the careful arrangement of tools around the workbench, the magnifying stand, the reference photographs Jace had printed of the original pin configuration. "You're spending a lot of time on it. It's a precise job." Danny was 26 and not unintelligent. He looked at Jace for a moment and then at the music box and said, with the tact of someone who had learned to read his employer's silences, "It going to play when you're done?" "That's the intention." "Cool," Danny said, and got his tool and left. Jace worked until 10, when he tested the cylinder against the full comb assembly for the first time, and the opening bars of Fur Elise came out clean and correct, small and bright, and slightly tentative the way music box music always was, like a memory of a song rather than the song itself. He sat back on his stool and held it in his hands and listened to it play through once. He thought about a 14-year-old girl on the stairs, listening to her grandmother in a kitchen before the rest of the house woke up. He thought about 6 years of a broken thing sitting on a shelf being too broken to use but too important to throw away. He set the box down and started cleaning up the workbench. He brought it back on a Friday afternoon, which was not a day he usually came to the building. He called ahead and told Marcus he was dropping something off. Marcus, who by this point had developed a detailed understanding of the situation without anyone briefing him on it, said he'd let Ms. Ashcroft know. She was in her office, and she looked up when he came in and registered the box in his hand and went very still. He set it on her desk in front of her. Fully restored, new pins where the originals were missing. Combs realigned, spring tension is adjusted. The cylinder should play cleanly through the full piece now. She looked at the box. She didn't open it immediately. "How did you know pins were missing?" "I looked up the composition, counted what should be there." She was quiet for a moment. "You looked up Fur Elise so you could count the pins on a music box cylinder. Had to know what was supposed to be there to know what was missing." She looked at him with an expression that he had learned over months to read more accurately than he'd initially been able to. It was the expression she had when something affected her more than she intended to allow, and she was deciding in real time how much of that to let be visible. She was letting more of it be visible than she used to. He noticed that. He didn't say it. She reached out and opened the lid. The mechanism caught, the cylinder turned, and Fur Elise came out of the box in the particular way it always had, small and precise, and carrying the specific emotional weight of a piece of music that has been associated with a specific memory for long enough that hearing it and having that memory have become the same act. She sat with her hand on the open lid and listened to it play. He watched her face. He had told himself he wasn't going to look, but he looked, because she had stopped being someone he looked away from at difficult moments. Her eyes were bright in a way that she was not attempting to manage. She blinked twice. She did not look away from the mechanism turning. When it finished its cycle, she closed the lid gently, the way you close something you understand is fragile, not because it's made of fragile material, but because of what it contains. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even, mostly. "It's a good mechanism," he said. "Once the pins were right, it wanted to play. Some things are just waiting for what's missing." She looked at him. He hadn't meant it to come out the way it sounded, or maybe he had. He wasn't entirely sure, which was itself unusual for him. He was generally sure about what he meant. He knelt beside her chair. The floor of her office was good hardwood, and his knees were 32 years old and had a combined history of concrete floors and metal grating that made kneeling a thing he noticed but didn't complain about. He knelt, and he was at eye level with her, which was different from the geography of most of their conversations. She looked at him. Close up, without a desk between them, she looked exactly like what she was. A person who had been through a great deal and was still here. "I heard what you whispered that night," he said. The room changed. He watched it happen in her face. First, the comprehension of what he meant, which arrived immediately because she was not a person who needed things explained twice. And then a visible heat in her face that he had never seen before, a color in her cheeks that she could not control and was not trying to, and something almost physical in the way her expression shifted. The exact quality of exposure that comes when something you said in the dark, something you were certain disappeared into the air, turns out to have been heard. "Which night?" she said, though she knew. "The blizzard." She looked at her hands. "I thought—" She stopped. "I thought you were in the mechanical room." "I'd finished. I was packing up." He kept his voice level. Not because the moment didn't warrant something other than level, but because level was what she needed. Something that held its shape while she found hers. "The hall carried the sound. I heard you." She was quiet for a long moment. He waited. "I'm not going to apologize for it," she said finally. She looked up at him. Her jaw was set in the way it set when she had decided something. "I meant it. I was tired and I was alone and I said something true that I had no intention of anyone hearing, but it was true." "I know it was true," he said. "You didn't say anything, that night or any of the nights after. All these months, you weren't ready, and neither was I." He paused. "And I wasn't sure that what I'd heard was an invitation. I wasn't going to treat it like one until I was sure." She looked at him. "What changed?" He thought about Saturdays in Avondale, about Lily drawing axolotls for her and Cam explaining motor controllers, and Tomas asking careful questions, and then going back upstairs with an apple, managing his hope with the precision of a kid who'd learned what happened when hope wasn't managed carefully. He thought about the charity event and the coffee on Damon, and the 14 months of network intercept data, and the things she'd said at the foundation dinner about the hardest kind of loss being the kind that changed the terms on which you understood yourself. He thought about Dana and her too-strong tea and the mug on the left side of the sink. "I understood what I was deciding," he said. "It took me a while, but I understand it now." He held her gaze. "I'm not someone who moves fast on things that matter." "I've noticed," she said, and it was dry and warm at the same time, the specific combination that was entirely hers. He took her hand. He did it the way he did most things, without announcement, without theater, just the direct act of reaching for something he'd decided he was going to reach for. Her hand was in both of his, and she looked at it, and then at him, and she said very quietly, "I still wish you were mine." And he said, "You already are." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding for some time. Not a dramatic exhale, just the specific release of something that had been held under compression for longer than was comfortable. The sound a system makes when the pressure finally equalizes. "That's a very mechanical way of saying that," she said. "I'm a mechanical person." "I know." She turned her hand in his. "I find it extremely inconvenient." "Why?" "Because I have spent 2 years constructing very good reasons why I should not want the things I want, and you dismantle them with the same expression you use when you're fixing a solenoid valve. Like it's simply a problem with an answer, and you can't quite understand why nobody fixed it sooner." He almost smiled. "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to need you to understand that I'm not easy, Jace. I don't mean that as a warning to make you reconsider. I mean it as a fact you should have complete information about. I work too much and I control things because not controlling them frightens me, and I have a mother who calls twice a week and cries, and I haven't fully processed that the people I trusted for 6 years were systematically stealing from me, and I'm still in the middle of a federal investigation that requires me to be deposed twice in the next month. I am not—" She paused. "I am not the easy version of this. I have 3 kids," he said. She blinked. "Tomas is 11 and is currently deciding whether to trust the world based on a sample size of 1 person who hasn't left yet. Cam is building a motor controller in a garage and will want to explain every stage of it in detail to anyone who is present. Lily will require you to have opinions about axolotls and will know if the opinions are not genuine." He looked at her. "I haven't slept past 6 in the morning since 2018. I still put a coffee mug on the left side of the sink every morning for a person who has been gone for 5 years, because I haven't figured out what it means to stop. I am also not the easy version." She looked at him for a long time. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said back. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a scene from anything. It was two people who had looked at the full inventory of what they were offering and decided that the total was worth it. Not because it was simple, but because they were both, in their different ways, people who did not walk away from things that needed doing just because the doing was hard. He stood up from the floor. She kept hold of his hand while he did, and let go when he was standing, and turned back to the music box on her desk. "Play it again," he said. She opened the lid. For Elise filled the office again, small and clear and repaired. The SEC investigation concluded 14 months after the shareholder meeting, with findings that consumed 340 pages of federal documentation and resulted in criminal charges against Davenport, Mercer, and two other senior executives on counts that included securities fraud, wire fraud, and unauthorized computer access. The civil proceedings were separate and longer. Patricia Osei managed both tracks simultaneously with the focused energy of a person who had been waiting for a case this clean for most of her career. Davenport's attorney made a motion to exclude Greg's forensic network evidence on chain of custody grounds. The motion was denied. Davenport was sentenced to 6 years. Mercer, whose attorney negotiated aggressively and whose age was cited as a mitigating factor, received 3 years probation and a fine that represented roughly 4% of what the fraud had cost the company over 14 months, which Patricia described as inadequate and which was also, she said, typical. Jace testified once, a deposition in a conference room in the federal building on Dearborn, 3 hours with 2 attorneys and a court reporter, describing in precise technical detail what he had found in the conduit rooms and how he had found it. He answered every question directly and without elaboration. And when the opposing attorney attempted to characterize his presence in the building's infrastructure systems as irregular, Jace explained calmly that he had been contracted to perform ventilation riser inspections, that the conduit rooms were adjacent to the riser housings, and that he was not required to ignore things he saw in spaces he was authorized to be in. The attorney had no productive follow-up to that. Celine sat through her own deposition the following week, with Patricia beside her and the full evidentiary record on a tablet in her lap. Jace waited in the lobby of the federal building for 4 hours and said nothing about waiting there because she hadn't asked him to wait. When she came out, she looked like someone who had spent 4 hours being very precisely controlled and was now releasing control in increments, the way pressure releases through a relief valve rather than all at once. He handed her a coffee he'd gotten from the cart in the lobby. She took it without saying anything, and they walked out into the October afternoon side by side. "How was it?" he asked. "Long," she said. "Thorough. The opposing counsel was very interested in the timeline of when I first suspected discrepancies." She drank the coffee. It was probably bad. She didn't mention it. Patricia says the deposition went well. Patricia's definition of well is that no one said anything that will hurt us in court. Did anyone say anything that will hurt you in court? No. Then it went well. She looked at him sideways. You have a very streamlined approach to litigation. I have a streamlined approach to most things. I know. A pause. It used to frustrate me. Now I find it useful. High praise. From me, she said, yes. The idea for the foundation had been Celine's, but the shape it took came from a conversation that happened on a Saturday morning in Avondale in late autumn, around the kitchen table, with Tomas. He was 12 by then, had turned 12 in September, with a birthday dinner that he'd asked to be small, and that was small, just the 5 of them, plus Carol, and a chocolate cake that Celine had not made herself, but had selected with the specific research intensity she brought to everything. Consulting Jace about Tomas's preferences a week in advance, and arriving with a cake from a bakery in Ukrainian village that Tomas had mentioned once, in passing, 3 months earlier, in a way that told Jace she had been paying attention in the way she paid attention to financial documents and building systems. Not recording for record's sake, but because the information mattered. Tomas had looked at the cake and then at her and said, "You remembered that." "You mentioned it," she said. "I mentioned it like once." "I know." He'd looked at her for a moment with that expression, the one where he was deciding something about whether to believe in something, and then he'd looked at the cake and said, "Can we eat it now, or do we have to sing first?" "We can do whatever you want," Celine said. "It's your birthday." "Then now," he said with considerable relief. The foundation conversation happened 6 weeks after the birthday, On a Saturday morning, while Cam was in the garage and Lily was constructing something elaborate with couch cushions in the living room, Tomas had come into the kitchen with a printout, a school assignment on nonprofit organizations, which required him to interview someone who worked in the nonprofit sector. He'd asked Celine, which was the kind of thing he'd started doing, asking her for specific things rather than waiting to see if she'd offer. "What does a foundation actually do?" he asked. "Like, practically, not the website version." Celine looked at him. The website version and the practical version should be the same thing. When they're not, that's usually a sign something is wrong with the organization. She thought for a moment. A foundation takes resources, money, capacity, expertise, and applies them to a problem that the market doesn't solve on its own, because there's no profit in solving it. What problem does yours solve? Currently, the Meridian Foundation funds mobility research and provides accessibility technology to people who can't afford it. Wheelchairs, adaptive devices, exoskeleton systems for people with spinal injuries. How do you know which people to help? We have a grant application process, medical need, financial need, but how do you know who doesn't apply? He said. The people who don't know it exists or don't think they qualify. Celine was quiet for a moment. She looked at the 12-year-old across the table with the expression she had when she was recalibrating something. "That's a real gap," she said. "Outreach. Most foundations are better at processing applications than finding the people who should be applying." Tomas shrugged. Kids in care don't apply for things because they've learned that applying for things usually doesn't work. He said it factually, the way he said things that came from his own experience. Not with performance, not seeking a reaction, just stating what he knew. If you want to help kids who lost their families, you have to go where those kids are. You can't wait for them to come to you. Jace watched Celine take this in. He watched her sit with it the way she sat with information that was rearranging something in her thinking. "What would that look like?" she said. "Practically." Tomas thought about it. "You'd have to go to the group homes, the shelters, the schools with high foster placement rates. You'd have to show up in person so kids could see that the thing exists and that it's for them." He paused. "Like someone showing up in person instead of waiting to be called." Jace looked at his coffee cup. Celine looked at Tomas for a long moment. "Would you want to be involved in designing that outreach?" "Practically. Not theoretically." Tomas looked at her with a suspicion that was also, underneath it, the specific alertness of someone who was very interested but did not want to be caught being very interested. "What would that mean?" "It would mean I need someone who understands the gap from the inside, and you clearly do." She said it without condescension, without the softening that adults put on things when they were adjusting their expectations for a child. She said it the way she said things she meant. "It's real work. I'd pay you for it." Tomas blinked. "Pay me?" Consultant rate for a minor is lower than for an adult, for legal reasons, but yes, real compensation for real work. He looked at his father. Jace kept his expression neutral, which took some effort. "Okay," Tomas said. "Yeah." He looked back at his printout. "Can I also use this for the school assignment?" "Yes," Celine said. "Cool." He got up, took his printout, and left the kitchen. They heard him on the stairs, and then the sound of his door, not closed all the way. Jace looked at Celine. "That was good," he said. "He's right," she said, "about the gap. I've been looking at the Foundation's reach statistics, and the application numbers have always felt low relative to the population we're supposedly serving." She was already thinking, he could see it. The same quality of attention she brought to balance sheets and building systems, turning on something new. If we restructured the outreach model around direct placement, actually going to where kids in the system are, we could probably triple the reach in the first year. "He's 12, Jace said. "You're going to pay him consultant rates." He identified a genuine strategic gap in about 40 seconds. She looked at him. "What would you pay for that?" He didn't have an answer for that, so he refilled her coffee instead. Maud. The exoskeleton came in January. It was not, as these things were sometimes described in press releases, a miracle. It was a piece of sophisticated engineering that Celine's company had been developing for 2 years as part of its mobility technology division, a product line she had redirected significant R&D investment toward after the board restructuring, with the specific focus of someone who understood both the technical requirements and the user experience from the inside. She had been working with the prototype in her rehabilitation sessions for 4 months before the production model was ready, and she told Jace about it on a Saturday morning in December with the matter-of-fact precision she brought to things she was privately more affected by than she let on. They expect full upright mobility in controlled environments by February, she said. I won't be able to walk independently. The exoskeleton handles the motor function. I give it the intent. It executes the movement. In uneven terrain or over long distances, I'll still use the chair. It's not a cure. She said the last part with the specific firmness of someone who had already had a version of this conversation with her mother and didn't want to have it again with different expectations. It's an addition, not a replacement. Okay, he said. My mother is going to cry. Your mother cries when she's happy too. I know. It's difficult to calibrate. She held her coffee cup. I wanted you to understand what it is before you saw it. So the first time you saw me use it, you weren't reacting to something you hadn't been prepared for. He looked at her. Celine, I've watched you run a company from that chair for the better part of a year. I've watched you present federal fraud evidence to 300 shareholders and not blink. I've watched you listen to a 5-year-old explain axolotl biology for 40 minutes without losing focus once. He paused. The exoskeleton is not going to change how I see you. I just want you to know it's working when you're trying to tell me something. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I wanted to tell you anyway. Then I'm glad you told me. She looked at him. Do you ever get tired of being steady? He thought about that. Sometimes, he said honestly, I get tired of the things that make being steady necessary. But no, being steady itself, not really. She nodded slowly. I used to be the steadiest person in any room I was in, before the crash. She paused. I thought I'd lost that. It took me a long time to understand that I hadn't lost it. I just had to find it again somewhere different. Where'd you find it? She looked at him steadily. I think you know where. He did. The charity event where she stood for the first time in public was a foundation fundraiser in late April, the second annual Meridian Children's Foundation benefit, which Tomas had had a hand in designing the outreach materials for, with the particular focus of a 13-year-old who had decided that something mattered and was going to make it matter properly. Jace knew it was coming. She had told him, quietly, the week before, that she was going to use the exoskeleton at the event, that she had been practicing, that it was not going to be perfect, and she was not approaching it as something that needed to be perfect. She said that last part deliberately, in the way she said things that she was saying as much to herself as to him. The venue was a ballroom in a downtown hotel, which meant carpet and a raised speaking platform, both of which the exoskeleton's adaptive balance system handled imperfectly. She had told him there was a slight latency on soft surfaces that required conscious compensation. He watched her arrive in the chair and move through the room, greeting people with the ease of someone who had done this many times. And he watched her speak from the seated position as she always did, clear and direct and without apology. And then, at the end of the program, she said, I'd like to show you something. She moved to the side of the platform. An aide helped her with the transition. It was not graceful. It was not cinematic. It was the specific practical choreography of a person managing a body with new technology that she'd had for 3 months and was still learning. There was a moment where the balance system compensated visibly, a slight correction that any engineer in the room would recognize as a control loop stabilizing. And then she was standing. Not walking, standing, upright at the edge of the platform, with the particular quality of someone who is concentrating and also is not going to let the concentration show more than necessary. She was not steady the way a person who has always had use of their legs is steady. She was steady the way someone is steady who has worked for 3 months toward a specific capability and is now demonstrating what 3 months of work looks like. Jace was at a table near the back with all 3 kids. Lily was between him and Tomas. Cam had turned completely in his chair to look. Lily said, in the specific, not quiet whisper of a 6-year-old, She's standing up, Daddy. She is, he said. Is that her new chair? It's something different. It helps her legs. Lily watched for a moment. Does it hurt? I don't think so. She looks... Lily searched for the word with the seriousness she brought to finding the right word for things. She looks like she's trying really hard. She is, Jay said. But she's doing it. Yeah, he said. She is. Tomas, beside him, said nothing. He watched Celine standing at the edge of the platform in front of 300 people, and his face had the expression that Jace had been learning to read over 3 years. The one that appeared when Tomas was feeling something that he hadn't yet decided whether to name. After the event, when the crowd had thinned and the kids were playing some invented game in the corner of the ballroom with the children of 2 other Foundation board members, Celine found Jace near the windows, and they stood. She in the chair again, the exoskeleton packed away, the practical reality of a long evening reasserting itself, and looked at the city lights below. Lily said you were trying really hard, he said. I heard her. A pause. She's right. She's usually right. Jace. She said his name the way she said it when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. I want to restructure the Foundation. He looked at her. Not the mission, the structure. She turned the chair slightly toward him. I want to fold the Mobility Technology Division into the Foundation's umbrella. Make the commercial research arm serve the nonprofit mission directly. Products that generate revenue fund research that helps people who can't pay. The exoskeleton technology we developed should be available to people who could never afford it on the commercial market. That changes your revenue model substantially. I know, Patricia thinks it's financially aggressive. Our new CFO thinks it's manageable if we structure it correctly. She paused. I've been in this chair for 2.5 years. I have more resources than I will ever use personally. If the technology that helps me stand up is only available to people who have my resources, then it's not really a solution. It's a product. He was quiet for a moment. Tomas is going to say he told you so. Tomas is going to be insufferable about it, she agreed. He's earned it. What do you need from me? She looked at him. There it was again. That look, the real one. Come to the board meeting when we present it, not in a professional capacity, just... She paused. I work better when I know you're in the room. He understood this. He had come to understand a great many things about her in a 1.5 years, and this was one of them. Not that she needed him to perform, not that his presence changed what she was capable of, but that having someone in the room who was there for her, rather than for the outcome, was a different kind of support than she'd had before. And she had learned to value it without making it into something she was ashamed of needing. I'll be there, he said. She nodded. Then she looked past him at the 3 kids in the corner, who had recruited the other children into what appeared to be an elaborate floor-based obstacle course made of cocktail napkins and chair legs, with Lily adjudicating from a position of considerable authority. We should probably retrieve them before they dismantle anything structural, she said. Cam's been looking at the stage rigging for 20 minutes. Jace said. That's a concern. I'll handle Cam. You get Lily before she reorganizes the entire room. He almost smiled. She almost smiled back. They went to collect their children. There is a photograph, not a professional photograph, not a Foundation press photo, but a picture that Carol took on her phone one morning in June, on the sidewalk outside the house in Avondale, that sits in a frame on the kitchen counter where the left side coffee mug used to be. In the photograph, Celine is in the chair with the particular morning light that comes through the oak tree on the street, and Jace is behind her, one hand on the push handle the way he is sometimes when they are moving quickly and the terrain is uneven, though in this photograph they are on a flat sidewalk, and he is not pushing, just standing with his hand resting there because they had been moving and then stopped. 3 kids are ahead of them on the sidewalk. Lily is mid-run, a blur of motion that the phone camera barely caught, and Cam is beside her looking at something on the ground. And Tomas is ahead of both of them, turned back toward his father and Celine with an expression that Carol caught at the exact right moment. The expression of a 13-year-old who has let himself believe in something and has stopped being afraid of being caught believing it. It is not a perfect photograph. The exposure is slightly off, Jace's face is partially in shadow, and there is a city trash can in the background that nobody noticed until the photo was taken. Jace put it in a frame anyway because the imperfect ones were usually the real ones. He told Celine about the mug. Not the morning of the photograph, not at some constructed moment, but on an ordinary evening in July when they were in the kitchen after the kids were in bed. She had stayed for dinner, which she did most Sundays now, with the comfortable regularity of a presence that had stopped needing to be explained or managed. He was washing dishes and she was at the table with her laptop, half working and half not. And he turned around to say something about whether she wanted more coffee. And he looked at the counter and the frame with the photograph was there, and the mug wasn't where it used to be because he'd moved it when he put the frame up. He stood for a moment with a dish towel in his hand. "I used to keep a mug on the left side of the counter," he said. She looked up from the laptop. She waited. "For Dana." He said it simply. "I moved it when I put the photograph up. I've been thinking about it since." He paused. "I want you to know that it wasn't—" He stopped, found the right words. "She was real. What we had was real. I'm not replacing it. I don't think you could replace something like that even if you tried." Celine was quiet. "But I put the photograph up," he said. "I want you to know I know what that means, that I know what I'm doing, because you said you needed someone with complete information." She looked at him for a long moment. In the specific quiet of a house with sleeping children and a July night outside and the small, ordinary sounds of a kitchen, she looked at him and he looked back. "I know you know what you're doing," she said. "You always know what you're doing. It's occasionally exhausting. You've mentioned." "I'm not replacing her either," Celine said. "I'm not in the business of replacing things. I'm in the business of building things that didn't exist before." She paused. "That's what we're doing, building something that didn't exist before. It doesn't have to be defined by what it isn't." He stood with the dish towel and looked at her. "You're very smart," he said. "I know." She turned back to the laptop. "Come sit down. I want to show you the foundation restructuring proposal and tell me if the language in Section 3 makes sense to someone who isn't a lawyer." He hung up the dish towel. He sat down at the table across from her. Outside, Chicago was warm and loud in the way of a July night. Distant traffic, someone's music 2 houses down, the specific fullness of a city in summer that felt like the opposite of that February night in a mechanical room when the storm was coming down sideways and the world had seemed very small and very white. He looked at the laptop screen. He read Section 3. "It makes sense," he said. "Change, facilitate, to support," in the second paragraph. It reads cleaner. "Done." She typed it. She glanced at him sideways. "See? Useful." "Glad to help." She closed the laptop most of the way. She looked at him across the table in his kitchen in Avondale, in the house with 3 sleeping children and a photograph on the counter and a music box on the credenza in an office 32 floors up that played Furelise cleanly now, every pin in place, nothing missing. "Jace?" "Yeah. I'm glad the elevator broke." He looked at her. He thought about an amber light on a building panel, about a blizzard that closed every road in the city, about a phone ringing at 9:30 at night while he was reading about a spider who had already decided to save someone. He thought about the things you couldn't plan and couldn't engineer and couldn't fix your way toward, the things that simply arrived in the worst weather at the least convenient time and turned out to be exactly what was needed. "Me too," he said. Outside, the city kept going the way cities do, loud and indifferent and full of people making decisions in the dark that would turn out to matter more than they knew. And in a kitchen on a street in Avondale, 2 people who had each survived the hardest versions of themselves sat at a table in the warm, ordinary light and did not need the moment to be anything other than what it was, which was enough, which was, it turned out, everything,